Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. All right, I'm just going to type this out. I don't know if anyone will even believe me, and honestly, I'm not sure I care. I just need to get it out of my head and into words. Maybe writing it down will make it feel less like a fever dream and more like something that actually happened, because my brain keeps trying to tell me it didn't. But it did. I was there. It was a Tuesday, middle of October, the kind of Tuesday that just drags on forever. I'd been stuck in the office all morning, and by 1 in the afternoon, I just couldn't take it anymore. I told my boss I had a site visit to do up near Sky Comish. It was a half-truth. I did have some paperwork to drop off for a client who lived way out there, but mostly I just needed to drive, to be alone with my thoughts and the sound of the engine. So I got in my car, my old Nissan Xterra. It's a 2008 forest green, with more than 200,000 miles on it. I call it the tank. It's got a few dents, and the check engine light is basically a permanent fixture, but it's never let me down. That day, I was grateful for the four-wheel drive. I got off Highway 2 just past the town of Index, taking one of those Forest Service roads that spiderweb off into the Cascades. This one was pretty well maintained, all things considered. A wide gravel logging road, not too many potholes. The sun was out, but under the canopy of these huge evergreens, it was all shadows and slivers of light. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, you know? Not peaceful, just waiting. I had my window down, and the air smelled like damp earth and pine. I remember the crunch of the gravel under my tires was the loudest thing, a steady rhythm that was almost soothing. I was driving slow, maybe 15 miles an hour, just taking it all in. My phone had lost service about 10 minutes back, so it was just me and the trees. And then this feeling started to creep up on me. It's hard to describe, it wasn't a thought. It was a physical sensation, a kind of pressure in my chest, and a cold prickle on the back of my neck. My skin got tight. It was this deep, intrusive knowing, a certainty that settled in my gut like a stone. I was going to see something. Not just an animal, not a deer or a raccoon. Something. I didn't know what, but the knowledge was just there, fully formed and terrifying. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel. I remember looking into the woods on my left, the ferns and the salal bushes so thick you couldn't see more than 10 feet in, and feeling like I was being watched, not by a person, something else. My heart was starting to beat a little faster. This was stupid. I was a grown man, 34 years old, and I was getting spooked by my own imagination in the middle of the day. I tried to laugh at myself, but it came out as a shaky breath. The feeling didn't go away. It got stronger. It was like an itch in my brain, a compulsion. Without even thinking about why, my hand moved from the wheel and I punched the center of it, hitting the horn. Honk! The sound was obscenely loud in the silence. It echoed through the trees, a sharp, rude noise. It felt wrong. I immediately felt stupid. What was I doing scaring off the squirrels? But the feeling, that dread, didn't fade. It intensified. It was screaming at me now. Do it again. So I did. I hit the horn, a second time. Honk. The echo of the second honk was still bouncing around the hills when everything happened at once. From the wall of brush on the right-hand side of the road, maybe 50 feet ahead of me, there was a sound. It wasn't a crack, it was a crunch. Like something huge just decided the vegetation was no longer an obstacle. The salal bushes and young alder trees didn't just part, they exploded outward, and this thing came out. It was massive. I mean, my brain instantly screamed, "Bear!" Because what else is that big in these woods? But in the same half second, I knew it wasn't. It was on all fours, but its build was all wrong. A bear is kind of round and bulky. This thing was rangy, powerful in a different way. Its shoulders were huge and sloped, and its back legs seemed longer, more powerful, and it was fast, unbelievably, heart-stoppingly fast. It didn't lumber, it flowed. It covered the distance from the tree line to the middle of the road in 2, maybe 3 bounds. The speed was effortless, like it was just flickering from one point to another. It stopped directly in front of my Xterra, maybe 20 feet away. And then it did something that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. It sat down. It didn't slump like a bear. It didn't hunch. It sat down Indian style, cross-legged, right there in the gravel. It was so fluid, so unnaturally human-like in that motion, that my brain just short-circuited. I was frozen, my foot instinctively stomping on the brake, the car lurching to a halt. Now I could see it clearly. It was covered in hair, fur, whatever you call it. It wasn't black or brown like a bear. It was ginger, a reddish, rusty ginger color, like an Irish setter, but thicker, coarser looking. It was matted in places with leaves and bits of twig. It was big. Sitting down, its head was still level with the hood of my Xterra. If it stood up, it would have been way, way taller than me. Its face. Oh God, its face. It wasn't a snout. It was flatter, human-like, just like the premise said. But that doesn't capture the wrongness of it. It had a prominent brow ridge, but underneath, the eyes. They weren't bear eyes. They were dark, deep-set, and I couldn't see any white. Just dark, intelligent pools. Its nose was broad and flat. Its mouth, it was chewing, slowly, deliberately. I could see the muscles in its jaw working. I don't know what it was eating. It looked like a wad of leaves or maybe bark. It just sat there chewing, staring off into the woods on the other side of the road. It never looked at me, not once. That was almost the worst part, the complete and utter disregard. I was sitting there in a 2-ton metal box, having just made a ton of noise, and this thing had just materialized in front of me with impossible speed, and now it was sitting like a man meditating, having a snack, and I didn't even register as a thing to be looked at. I was furniture. I was nothing. The engine was still running. I could feel the slight vibration through the seat. I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I couldn't breathe. I was just taking tiny, shallow sips of air. My whole body was rigid with a terror so pure it was like a physical force holding me down. And then the second wave hit, a new sensation, even more invasive than the first. It wasn't a feeling of being watched anymore. It was a knowing, a certainty, just as solid as the one that told me to honk the horn. There was another one, close. In the trees to my left, right where I'd been feeling those eyes earlier. I couldn't see it. I didn't hear anything, but I knew it was there. I could feel its presence like a weight, a pressure against my skin. It was bigger. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. This one felt older, heavier, and it was watching. Not me, necessarily. It was watching the one in the road. The one in the road kept chewing. It lifted a hand, a paw, whatever, to its mouth. The arm was long and muscular, covered in that same ginger fur. The fingers, they weren't claws like a bear's. They were thick, powerful digits, and I saw what looked like a thumb. It was so damn casual. That's when the word popped into my head, clear as day. Playful. Its demeanor was almost playful. Not menacing, not aggressive. It had burst out with this terrifying, effortless speed, planted itself in front of me, and now it was just chilling. It was like it was saying, look what I can do, and look, I don't even have to care that you're there. That thought, more than anything else, broke the spell of my paralysis. My right hand, moving on pure animal instinct, slammed the gear shift into reverse. I didn't look behind me. I just stomped on the gas. The tires spun in the gravel for a heart-stopping second before catching, and the Xterra shot backward. The steering wheel jerked in my hands as the rear end started to fishtail on the loose surface. I was driving backward way too fast, watching the thing in the road through the windshield. It didn't move, it didn't flinch, it just kept sitting there, chewing, looking away. It was like I was a ghost, and my noisy, frantic retreat was just a gust of wind. I must have reversed for a quarter of a mile, my eyes glued to that spot, expecting it to get up and give chase with that same impossible speed, but it never did. The road was straight enough that I could see the spot for a long time, and the ginger-colored shape just got smaller and smaller, still sitting, until a bend in the road finally hid it from view. The second it was out of sight, I jammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. I wrestled the gear shift into drive, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage it. I spun the wheel and accelerated down the road, back the way I had come. Gravel sprayed from the tires. I didn't slow down. I drove like a maniac, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, expecting to see one of them loping after the car. I didn't breathe properly until I was back on asphalt, back on Highway 2. The familiar hum of the pavement under my tires was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I drove 10 miles over the speed limit, all the way back to Monroe, my whole body trembling. I had to pull over twice because I felt like I was going to be sick. The rest of the day was a blur. I dropped off the paperwork, my hands still unsteady. I must have looked like hell, because the client asked me if I was feeling okay. I just mumbled something about a long drive. The terror of its speed and the way it sat there haunted me. It was all I could think about. The image was burned into the back of my eyelids. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The ginger fur, the human-like face, the casual cross-legged pose. A couple days later, I was back at work, still feeling off. I was having coffee with a colleague, Mark, who's a big outdoorsman, hunts, fishes, spends every weekend in the mountains. I didn't tell him the whole story. I was too scared he'd laugh at me. I just framed it as a weird bear encounter. "Hey, Mark," I said, trying to sound casual. "I saw a weird bear up near Index the other day. Big reddish one. It ran out in front of my car and then just sat down in the road, cross-legged. And it never looked at me. You ever hear of a bear doing that?" Mark took a sip of his coffee and frowned. "A bear sitting cross-legged? No, no way. They don't have the hip structure for that. They can sit up on their haunches, but it's a different posture and not looking at you. A bear that just charged out of the brush would be keyed up, looking for a threat. It would definitely be looking at you, especially if you were in a vehicle. That's not bear behavior at all." He said it so matter-of-factly. It wasn't a bear. This expert, this guy who knew the woods better than anyone I knew, had just confirmed the deepest, most terrifying part of my fear. It wasn't a bear. I just nodded and changed the subject, but inside, my stomach was sinking. The encounter's surreal nature, the thing I'd been trying to rationalize away, was now solidified. It was real, and I had no idea what it was. The playful, effortless, utterly alien demeanor of it, the feeling of the other one watching from the trees, the intrusive intuition that told me to honk my horn, like I was ringing a doorbell for something I never ever wanted to see. That was 5 years ago. I still have the X-Terror. I still drive up Highway 2 sometimes for work. But I never ever turn down that logging road. I don't even look down it as I pass. And sometimes, late at night, the memory of it hits me fresh, and I'll just sit up in bed, my heart hammering, feeling that cold prickle on my neck all over again, seeing that massive, ginger-furred thing sitting in the gravel, chewing, acting like I wasn't even there. Story 2. Okay, so I've never really shared this with anyone outside of a couple of close friends, but I've been sitting on it for years now, and I guess it's time to get it out there. This happened back when I was working for a logging road company in the Cascades of Oregon. I was in my late 20s, just trying to make a living, you know? The job wasn't glamorous, mostly driving around, checking on roads that had been damaged by weather or heavy use, making sure they were safe for the big rigs to pass through. It was solitary work, which I usually didn't mind. I liked the quiet, The way the forest felt like it was just breathing around you. But that day, everything changed. It was a crisp morning in early fall. I remember that much. The air had that bite to it, the kind that makes you pull your jacket a little tighter. I'd been assigned to check out a section of road that had washed out after some heavy rains the week before. The company was worried about erosion, so they sent me out to assess the damage and see if we needed to bring in equipment to fix it. I drove my truck, a beat-up old Ford, down this narrow, winding road that cut through dense forest. The trees were mostly Douglas firs, tall and dark, with that damp, earthy smell that hangs in the air after rain. The road itself was rough, gravel and dirt with potholes everywhere, and in some spots you could see where the water had carved deep gullies along the edges. I'd been driving for about an hour, taking it slow when I came to the washed-out section. It wasn't too bad, just a slump where the road had given way, leaving a mess of mud and rocks. I parked the truck on the shoulder, got out and started poking around. My job was to take notes, maybe snap some photos, so I had my clipboard and camera with me. As I was walking along the edge, something caught my eye up on a rocky outcrop to the left of the road. It was this glint, like sunlight hitting metal or glass, and it stood out because everything else was just shades of green and brown. Curiosity got the better of me. I've always been a bit of a rock hound, and in my free time, I'd sometimes chip away at interesting formations, looking for minerals or fossils. So I decided to climb up and check it out. The outcrop was maybe 15 feet high, steep, but not impossible. I grabbed my rock hammer from the truck, I always kept it handy, and started scrambling up. The rocks were slick with moisture, and my boots slipped a couple of times, but I made it to the top. Up close, the shiny thing turned out to be a vein of quartz or something similar, glittering in the weak morning light. I got excited, thinking I might find something cool, so I started chipping away with the hammer. The sound of metal on rock echoed a little in the quiet, but otherwise it was peaceful. I could hear birds chirping somewhere in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, normal forest sounds. Then I heard it, this clicking noise coming from the brush across the road. At first I thought it might be a squirrel or a bird, maybe even a deer snapping twigs, but it was different, sharper, more rhythmic, like two stones being tapped together. It stopped for a second, then started up again. I paused my hammering and listened. The clicking was steady, almost deliberate, and it was getting on my nerves. I figured maybe it was another worker messing with me or some hiker who'd wandered off trail. So I stood up, cupped my hands around my mouth and yelled, "Hey, who's there? Show yourself!" No response. The clicking stopped dead, and for a moment, everything went silent. Not even the birds were making noise now, which felt weird. The air grew heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. I remember feeling a prickle on the back of my neck, this unease creeping in. I took a step closer to the edge of the outcrop, peering into the thick brush across the road. It was dense, a tangle of ferns and young trees, and I couldn't see anything moving. Part of me wanted to just shrug it off and get back to my rocks, but another part was getting jumpy. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something feels off, and this felt off. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, a rock the size of a grapefruit came flying out of the brush. I didn't see it until it was almost on me. It whizzed through the air with this whistling sound and smashed into the rocks right next to my head. I felt the impact vibrate through the ground, and fragments of stone sprayed against my face and arms. One piece nicked my cheek, and I felt a sting, followed by the warm trickle of blood. For a second, I just froze, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. That rock could have killed me if it had hit my head. It was aimed right at me, no doubt about it. Panic hit me like a physical blow. My hands were shaking, and I dropped my rock hammer. Instinct took over. I always carried a .45 pistol on my hip when I was out in remote areas. Company policy. Plus, it made me feel safer against bears or whatever. I fumbled for it, my fingers slick with sweat, and managed to draw it. I didn't even think. I just pointed it toward the sky and fired a warning shot. The bang was deafening, echoing through the trees and making my ears ring. As the sound faded, I saw movement in the brush. Something tall and dark burst out from the foliage and ran on two legs into the trees on the other side of the road. It happened so fast, but I got a clear look. This thing was huge, at least 7 feet tall, covered in thick black hair from head to toe. It moved with this unnatural speed, loping like a man, but with a grace that was almost animal. And the smell. Oh God, the smell hit me then. It was this foul, musky stench, like rotten meat mixed with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. It made my eyes water and my stomach churn. I stood there, pistol still in hand, staring at the spot where it had disappeared. My legs felt like jelly, and I could barely breathe. The stench lingered in the air, clinging to my clothes and the back of my throat. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. I scrambled down from that outcrop so fast I almost fell, my boots skidding on the loose rocks. I didn't bother grabbing my hammer or anything else, just ran for the truck. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears, and every shadow in the forest seemed to be moving. I jumped into the driver's seat, fumbled with the keys, and started the engine. I peeled out, spraying gravel everywhere, and didn't look back. I drove like a maniac, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. The whole way back, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing chasing me. But the road was empty, just trees and more trees. It took me a good 20 minutes to calm down enough to drive normally. I was shaking all over, covered in sweat and dirt, with that cut on my cheek still bleeding a little. The musky smell seemed to have followed me into the cab, and I rolled down the windows, gulping in the fresh air. When I got back to the company yard, I must have looked like hell because my supervisor asked if I was okay. I mumbled something about slipping on the rocks and headed home early. I didn't tell anyone what really happened, not yet. I was too freaked out, and I figured no one would believe me anyway. Later that day, I met up with a friend of mine, a guy who's been hunting and camping in these mountains his whole life. We were having a beer at his place, and I must have been acting weird because he asked what was wrong. So I spilled it all. The clicking, the rock, the creature, the smell. He listened quietly, not interrupting, and when I finished, he just nodded slowly. He told me that what I described sounded like a Bigfoot, and that the rock throwing and the stench were classic signs. He said they're known to do that as a warning when they're angry or feel threatened, and that the odor is something they release to mark territory or scare off intruders. Hearing him say it made my skin crawl. I'd heard the stories, of course, everyone out here has, but I never put much stock in them until that day. I've never gone back to that spot. I asked the company to reassign me to different routes, and they did, no questions asked. But to this day, I can't shake the memory. Sometimes when I'm out in the woods, I'll catch a whiff of something musky, and my heart will start racing all over again. I don't know what I saw that day, and I probably never will. It's just one of those things that stays with you, you know? A close call that left me terrified and wondering what else is out there in those deep, dark forests. Story 3. All right, I've been sitting on this for a long time, but I need to get it out. I've never posted anything like this before, but I found this place and figured if anyone would get it, it's you guys. This happened to me and my son on the 23rd of April 2008. I remember the date because it was my wife's birthday, and we were supposed to be back in time for dinner. We never made it. I was driving the Alcan Highway, way out west of the US-Canada border. It's just this endless strip of asphalt cutting through nothing. Trees on both sides, so thick you can't see 10 feet into them, and these big empty skies that make you feel tiny. My boy was in the passenger seat, 16 years old at the time, fiddling with the radio and getting nothing but static. We'd been driving for hours. The road was mostly empty, just us and the occasional trucker heading the other way. A flash of metal and then silence again. The road dipped down into a slight descent ahead. It wasn't a steep hill, just a long, gentle slope where you could see the road stretching out for maybe half a mile. The sun was starting to get low, casting long shadows from the trees, but it was still full daylight. That's when I saw it. Way up ahead, I'd say 3/10 of a mile, maybe a bit less, something crossed the road. It came from the left tree line and moved to the right. My first thought, and I remember this so clearly because it was so stupid, was, well, there's a Sasquatch up the road. I actually chuckled to myself. It was a joke. My brain just threw it out there because the shape was wrong for a person, but I figured it had to be a person. I expected to see a cabin or a truck parked off to the side, some sign of life. A hunter in coveralls, maybe. That's what my rational mind was insisting it was. I didn't say anything to my son. He was still messing with the radio, not paying attention. I just kept driving, my eyes locked on the spot where the figure had disappeared into the trees on the right. The descent was gentle, so we were coasting down, and it felt like it took forever to reach the spot. As we got closer, the joke started to feel thin. There was nothing there. No houses, no driveways, no parked car, no person. Just the solid wall of trees on either side of the road. I slowed down a little, my foot easing off the gas. My son noticed the change in speed and looked up. "What's up?" he asked. "Thought I saw something," I said, my voice sounding normal, but my heart was starting to thump a little harder in my chest. We reached the exact spot. I know it was the exact spot because there was a weird, stunted little pine tree right on the edge of the shoulder, its branches all twisted. I looked to the left, where it had come from, just endless, dark forest. I looked to the right, where it had gone. More of the same, deep, shadowy woods that swallowed the light. That's when the dread started to bloom in my stomach. A cold, heavy feeling. It wasn't a sudden panic. It was a slow, creeping realization that what I had seen didn't make any sense. If it was a person, where did they go? They couldn't have just vanished into that thick underbrush that fast. You'd hear branches snapping, see movement. There was nothing. Absolute stillness. My mind started replaying what I had seen, and the details I'd brushed aside came rushing back with terrifying clarity. The figure was walking upright. That was the first thing, but its gait. It was long, really long. Not like a tall man stretching his legs, but a smooth, powerful stride that covered a huge amount of ground. Its arms swung, but they swung in a way that was loose, heavy, and the color. It was all one color, a solid matte rust brown, like those Carhartt coveralls you see construction workers wear, but it wasn't bulkier at the top like a jacket. It was just this uniform color from head to toe, like a single garment and my brain shied away from the thought like fur. Then I remembered the proportions. The arms were too long. I could see them swinging and they hung down past its knees, way past, and the neck. It had a long neck, or at least its head was set forward on its shoulders in a way that made it seem long. The whole silhouette was wrong. It was like someone had taken a human shape and stretched it out, made it lankier and more powerful at the same time. It didn't look at us. It just moved across the road in maybe 3 or 4 of those long strides and was gone into the trees. It never broke its rhythm. It never turned its head. It was just passing through. "Dad, you okay?" my son asked. He was looking at me now, his face concerned. "You're white as a sheet." "I'm fine," I lied, but my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I could feel a cold sweat on my back, soaking into my shirt. Just thought I saw a moose or something. He bought it, or at least he didn't push it. He went back to the radio. I hit the gas, pushing the speed up a little, wanting to put distance between us and that spot. My eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, expecting to see something standing on the road behind us or emerging from the trees. There was nothing, just the empty road receding into the distance. For the next 20 minutes, I didn't speak. I just drove, my mind racing. I've always been a skeptic. Bigfoot? Come on, it's campfire stories and blurry videos. It's nonsense, I'd have bet my life on it. But what I saw, it matched. It matched the TV depictions I'd laughed at. The upright walk, the long arms, the bulky, hairy body. But seeing it in real life, in the clear light of a spring afternoon, it wasn't funny, it was horrifying. The reality of it was in the details you don't get on TV. The way the light didn't gleam off its coat, it was that matte, dusty brown that absorbed the light, the utter silence of its movement. There was no sound, no crunch of gravel, no rustle of leaves as it entered the woods. It was just there, and then it wasn't. The sheer isolation of the place hit me. We were in the middle of nowhere. The closest town was probably 100 miles away. If that thing was real, it could be out there right now, watching us from the tree line. I started noticing the forest differently. Every dark space between the trees felt like a hiding place. Every snapped branch I saw from the car looked intentional. My heart wouldn't slow down. It was a steady, pounding drum in my ears. I finally pulled over at a scenic overlook about 40 minutes later. I needed to breathe. I got out of the car and my legs felt shaky. The air was cold and clean. My son got out too, stretching. "You sure you're okay?" he asked again. "I saw something back there, son," I said, my voice low. I couldn't keep it in anymore. "Yeah, a moose?" I shook my head. I looked out at the vast, untouched wilderness stretching out below us, a sea of green and gray. No, not a moose. I described it to him. I didn't use the word, I just told him what I saw. The upright walk, the long arms, the color, the way it moved. He listened quietly, his teenage smirk gone, replaced by a serious expression. "Whoa," he said when I finished. "Like Bigfoot?" I didn't answer. I just stared into the trees. That was the first time the word had been spoken aloud. It hung in the air between us, ridiculous and terrifying all at once. The rest of the drive home was tense. We were both jumpy. Every shadow was a figure. Every deer that flickered at the edge of the road made my heart leap into my throat. We got home hours late. My wife was pissed until she saw our faces. We were both pale, quiet. Later that night, after my son had gone to bed, I told her everything. I spilled it all out, the whole experience, every detail I could remember. The joke I'd made to myself, the creeping dread, the terrifying clarity of the memory. I expected her to laugh or tell me I was tired from driving. She didn't. She got quiet. Then she went to her computer. She was online for about an hour while I just sat in the living room, feeling hollowed out. When she came back, her face was grim. She showed me the screen. It was a forum like this one, but older. She'd found a cluster of reports from the same general area of the Alcan Highway, all within the last 5 years. People seeing a tall bipedal creature, rust brown in color, crossing the road and vanishing into the woods. One guy, a trucker, described it exactly as I had. Like a man in Carhartt coveralls, but the arms were all wrong and it moved too smooth. Reading those other accounts, that's what really got to me. It wasn't just me. I wasn't going crazy. Other people had seen the same thing, in the same place. The exact same thing. I've spent the years since then trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a guy in a suit. But why? Why would someone be wearing a detailed head-to-toe Sasquatch suit in the absolute middle of nowhere, miles from any road or town, just to walk across a highway in the middle of the day? It makes no sense, and the way it moved, it wasn't a man's walk. The stride was too long, the swing of the arms too fluid and heavy. The encounter left me unsettled in a way that's hard to describe. It's not a fear that something is going to jump out at me. It's a deeper, more profound unease. It's the knowledge that the world is a lot bigger and a lot stranger than I was taught to believe. That in all those vast, empty spaces on the map, things might be walking around that we don't understand, that we can't explain. I'd always dismissed Bigfoot as nonsense, a fun story. But I can't dismiss what I saw with my own eyes. I can't unsee that rust-brown figure moving with that impossible, silent grace across the asphalt and disappearing into the shadows like it was never there at all. I was left with just the empty road, the silent trees, and a feeling that I'd glimpsed something I was never supposed to see, and I still don't know what it was. Story 4. So, I've been sitting on this for a while now, mostly because every time I try to talk about it, I get this weird chill down my spine, like my body's reminding me not to poke at it too much. But I need to get it out there, you know? Maybe someone else has been through something similar, or maybe I'm just losing it. Either way, here goes. It was one of those hot, sticky Florida days in late summer, the kind where the air feels thick enough to chew, and the humidity wraps around you like a wet blanket. My friend and I had decided to spend the day exploring this national forest a couple hours from where we live. We're not hardcore hikers or anything, just a couple of guys who like to get out of the city sometimes, breathe some fresh air, and maybe forget about work for a bit. That day we'd packed some snacks, lots of water, and just aimed to wander without a real plan. The forest was dense, with tall pines and cypress trees casting long shadows, and the ground was soft underfoot from recent rains. Everything smelled like damp earth and pine needles, and the only sounds were our own footsteps and the occasional bird call echoing through the trees. We'd been walking for what felt like a couple of hours, just following a faint trail that wound through the undergrowth. The heat was starting to get to us, and we were both sweating through our shirts. I remember wiping my forehead with the back of my hand and feeling the grit from the trail mix we'd eaten earlier. My friend was a few steps ahead, humming some tune under his breath, and I was just taking it all in, trying to enjoy the peace. But then, off in the distance, we heard it. The gentle, steady sound of running water. It was faint at first, like a whisper. But as we moved closer, it grew louder, and we both perked up. Water meant a chance to cool off, maybe even rinse some of the sweat and grime away. We pushed through a thicket of ferns and saw it. A shallow brook, maybe 10 feet wide, cutting through the forest floor. The water was clear, bubbling over smooth grey rocks that lined the bottom. Sunlight filtered through the canopy above, dappling the surface with shifting patterns of light. It looked inviting, almost too perfect. My friend grinned at me and said something like, "Let's check it out." And we made our way down the bank. The ground was muddy near the water's edge, squelching under our boots, and the air felt cooler here, with a faint mist rising from the stream. We spent what must have been 20 minutes just wading in the shallow parts, splashing water on our faces and arms. The cold was a shock at first, but it felt amazing after the heat. I remember kneeling down on one of the larger rocks, letting the water rush over my hands, and noticing how the stones under the surface were worn smooth, almost polished. My friend was a little further upstream, skipping a small, flat rock across the surface. Everything felt calm, normal, like any other day out in nature. We weren't talking much, just enjoying the moment, and I remember thinking how lucky we were to have this spot all to ourselves. But then things started to shift. It was subtle at first, just a feeling in the pit of my stomach, like when you sense someone watching you but can't see them. I shrugged it off, blaming it on the isolation or maybe the heat getting to my head. But then the noises started. Not loud, not at first, just the sound of rocks shifting, like someone was gently moving them around. I thought it might be the water playing tricks, or an animal rustling in the bushes. My friend must have heard it too, because he stopped what he was doing and looked over at me, his expression shifting from relaxed to alert. "You hear that?" he whispered, and I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. The sounds grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just shifting, it was like rocks were being tossed, colliding with each other in a way that didn't make sense. Clack, 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 sharp and rhythmic, coming from the bank we'd just left. My heart started to pound, a dull thud in my chest that seemed to echo in my ears. I remember the hairs on my arms standing up and a cold sweat breaking out on my back despite the heat. We both froze, staring in the direction of the noise. The forest had gone quiet around us, like everything else was holding its breath too. No birds, no insects, just that unnerving sound of rocks being moved, as if someone or something was deliberately rearranging them. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear, maybe a wild boar. But the sounds didn't match. Bears might knock things over, but this was too deliberate, too focused. It sounded like someone was picking up rocks and throwing them one after another. I could feel my muscles tensing, ready to bolt, but I was rooted to the spot, my eyes glued to the tree line. My friend took a step closer to me, his hand gripping my arm tightly. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, his voice shaky. Then we saw it, just a glimpse, but enough to sear itself into my memory. Something large and dark moved at the edge of the brook, maybe 30 feet away. It was ape-like, covered in shaggy, dark hair, and it moved with a speed that took my breath away. One moment it was there, half hidden by the foliage, and the next it was charging away from the water, crashing through the undergrowth with a force that made the ground vibrate. It wasn't running toward us, thank God, but away, deeper into the forest. The sight lasted only a second or two, but it was enough to send a jolt of pure terror through me. I felt my legs go weak, and I had to brace myself against a rock to keep from stumbling. The noise stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of the creature's retreat, snapping branches and heavy footsteps fading into the distance. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and too loud, and my friend's quick, shallow pants beside me. The air felt heavy, charged with something I can't describe, like the stillness after a storm, but with an underlying dread that made my skin crawl. Slowly, cautiously, we made our way back to the bank where we'd been standing earlier. The mud was churned up, and the rocks were scattered in a way that looked intentional, almost like they'd been stacked or thrown into a pile. It wasn't natural. Rocks don't just end up like that on their own. My friend pointed to a spot near the water's edge, and that's when we saw it, a single footprint in the mud, clear as day. It was a left foot pressed deep into the soft earth, with the toes pointing toward the water. The print was huge, way bigger than any human foot I've ever seen, with a shape that was vaguely human-like but broader, more splayed out. The details were sharp. The arch was high, and there were what looked like claw marks at the tips, though I can't be sure. It was fresh, the mud still wet and glistening around the edges. I remember kneeling down to get a closer look, my hands trembling. The print was so distinct, so out of place, that it felt like proof we weren't crazy. My friend was already pulling out his phone, but of course we had no service out there, and neither of us had thought to bring a camera. We just stared at it, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The air around us felt colder now, and I had this overwhelming urge to get out of there, to put as much distance between us and that spot as possible. We didn't say much as we started back toward the car. The walk felt twice as long as before, every sound in the forest making me jump, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. It all seemed amplified, like the woods were taunting us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing following us, but there was nothing, just the quiet, oppressive weight of the forest. My friend was walking fast, almost at a jog, and I had to hurry to keep up. The whole time, my mind was racing, replaying the sight of that creature and the sound of those rocks. What was it? Why was it throwing rocks? The questions piled up, but there were no answers. By the time we reached the car, the sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. We were both covered in sweat and mud, and the relief of being back in a familiar place was overwhelming. But as we stood there, catching our breath, I remembered the footprint. I suggested we go back, maybe try to preserve it with something. But when we looked at the mud on our boots, it was already drying, cracking into a web of fine lines. The moment had passed. Whatever evidence there was, had vanished with the heat. We just stood there for a minute, silent, before getting into the car and driving away. The ride home was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. I kept seeing that ape-like shape in my mind, the way it moved, so fast, so powerful. And those rocks, the way they'd been tossed around like toys, it didn't feel random. It felt purposeful, like a warning or a message. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that we stumbled into something we weren't supposed to see. My friend and I have talked about it a few times, but we always end up going in circles because there's no explanation that makes sense. No animal I know of acts like that, and the footprint, well, it's just gone. I still wonder what it was, out there in those woods. Sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep, I'll hear a noise outside and my heart will start racing all over again. That day changed something in me, made me realize how little we really know about the world, and that footprint, dried and cracked in the mud, feels like a ghost now, a reminder of something I can't explain, no matter how hard I try. Story 5. It was a Friday night, and we'd been driving around in Tyler's beat-up sedan, just killing time. The sky was clear, but there was no moon, so it felt darker than usual. Cole brought up the barn. He'd heard some older kids talking about how creepy it was, and he dared us to go inside. Tyler was always the cautious one, but even he agreed after a few minutes of us egging him on. We parked the car about 100 yards from the barn, down a dirt road that was overgrown with weeds. The air was cool but not cold, and there was this weird stillness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I remember feeling a little jumpy already, but I didn't want to admit it. We got out of the car with our flashlights, the cheap kind you buy at the gas station, and started walking toward the barn. The whole place was falling apart. The wood was grey and splintered, and the roof sagged in the middle. There was this sour smell hanging in the air, like rotten eggs or something dead nearby. It hit me as soon as we got close, and I gagged a little. Cole made a joke about it being my cooking, but his voice was shaky. We were all trying to act tough, but the silence was getting to us. The barn door was half off its hinges, creaking in the wind. Tyler pushed it open, and the sound was so loud it made me jump. Inside, it was pitch black except for our flashlight beams cutting through the dust. The floor was covered in hay and dirt, and there were old tools scattered around, rusty pitchforks, a broken wagon wheel, stuff like that. We started joking again, saying stupid things like, "Hope no ghosts are home," and laughing too loud, but it felt forced. The air was thick and heavy, and every little noise made my heart skip a beat. We'd only been in there a couple of minutes when we heard it, a slow, dragging sound from the loft above us. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, but then dust started drifting down, little particles floating in the flashlight beams. We all stopped talking at the same time. Cole shined his light up toward the loft, but we couldn't see anything except darkness. The dragging sound got louder, like something heavy was being pulled across the floorboards up there. Tyler whispered, "What the hell is that?" And his voice was so quiet I barely heard him. Then came this low, guttural noise. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deeper, almost like a growl, but with a raspy edge that made my stomach clench. The sound echoed through the barn, and I felt it in my chest like a vibration. My hands started shaking, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight. Cole took a step back, and I saw his face go pale in the light. We were all frozen, just staring up at the loft. That's when we saw the hands, massive, hairy hands gripping the edge of the loft. They were huge, like twice the size of a man's hands, covered in dark, matted hair. The fingers were thick and ended in what looked like claws. My breath caught in my throat and I couldn't move. Then the face came into view. It was broad and leathery, with skin that looked rough and weathered. The eyes were dull red, like embers, and they seemed to glow in the darkness. It had large, uneven teeth that were yellowed and jagged. And when it snarled, the sound was so deep, it felt like the whole barn shook. I don't know how long we stood there. Maybe a second, maybe longer. But then it lunged, it jumped down from the loft, and the landing cracked the floorboards beneath it. The impact was so hard, I felt it through my feet. That's when we screamed and turned to run. I don't even remember deciding to run. My body just did it. We bolted for the door, scrambling over each other. The smell of rot got stronger, like it was clinging to us, and I could hear its heavy footsteps behind us, pounding on the floor like drums. Bursting outside, the cold air hit my face, but I didn't feel relief. I could hear it gaining on us, its footsteps deafening, like it was right on our heels. We sprinted toward the car, our legs burning. Tyler fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so bad he dropped them. I bent down to grab them, and when I looked back, I saw it, a towering dark shape in the doorway of the barn, standing on two legs. It was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, and it let out another growl that made my blood run cold. Tyler got the door open, and we piled into the car. He turned the key, but the engine just clicked. Nothing. Panic shot through me like electricity. I was in the back seat, and I could see the shape moving toward us, fast. It wasn't running. It was like it was gliding, but with those heavy steps. Tyler tried again, and this time the engine roared to life. He slammed it into reverse, and we peeled out, kicking up dirt and gravel. As we sped away, the headlights swept across the field, and for a second they caught the shape. It was moving away from us, walking on 2 legs into the trees. It was dark and hairy, and it moved with a grace that didn't match its size. We didn't say a word the whole drive back. We just sat there, shaking, covered in sweat. The smell of rot was still in the car, and it took days to get rid of it. We got back to Tyler's house and didn't sleep that night. We just sat in his room, staring at the walls, too scared to talk about what happened. The next day, Tyler's dad went out to the barn and found the door torn off, fresh claw marks on the wood, and these huge human-like footprints in the mud. He called the authorities, but they said it was probably vandals or animals. We knew better. We'd seen it. Since then, there have been reports of mutilated livestock in the area, and sometimes at night, you can hear eerie sounds coming from those fields. But that day, that one day, is burned into my memory. I still have nightmares about those red eyes and that guttural sound. I don't know what it was, and I don't think I ever will. Story 6. It was supposed to be our last big hurrah. Me, Mark and Lance, we were all 17, that weird age where you're not a kid anymore, but you're not really an adult, and you can feel the whole world starting to close in on you. Jobs, college, real life, it was all waiting for us back in Houston, British Columbia. So we planned this trip, Tatsa Lake, way the hell out northwest of Francois Lake, the kind of place you don't just drive to. We had to get flown in by a guy in a little float plane. I remember the noise of the engine was so loud we couldn't talk, just watched the endless green of the trees and the blue of the lakes slide by underneath us until the pilot pointed down at this tiny, glittering spot and started his descent. He dropped us off on this gravel beach. The sound of the plane fading away is something I'll never forget. It wasn't just quiet. It was a silence that had weight to it. It pressed in on your ears. You could hear your own heartbeat. We set up camp right there on the beach, our 2 tents facing the water, our backs to this wall of forest so thick and dark, it felt like it was watching us. We laughed it off, of course, made jokes about bears and getting eaten, but the feeling was there right from the start, this low-level hum of wrongness. The first night was okay. We had a fire, cooked some hot dogs, talked about stupid stuff, but I didn't sleep well. The ground was hard, and the silence was just so absolute. Then I woke up. It must have been 2 or 3 in the morning. It was pitch black, and the fire was just embers, and I heard it. A cry. It was far away, way off in the mountains across the lake, but it cut through that silence like a knife. It wasn't a wolf. I've heard wolves. It wasn't a coyote. It was wrong. It started low, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to shake the air, and then it rose into this high, shrieking wail that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It was unnatural. It sounded angry and lonely and huge. I lay there in my sleeping bag, not moving a muscle, just listening to the echo of it fade away. I could hear Mark and Lance breathing in their own tent, and I knew they were awake too, listening. Nobody said a word. What was there to say? The next morning, we were all a bit quiet. The sun was out, the lake was beautiful, and we tried to act normal. We needed water, so Mark and I took the collapsible bucket and walked down the shoreline to where a little stream fed into the lake. The ground was soft and muddy there. And that's where we saw them, footprints. They were sunk deep into the black mud, right at the edge of the trees. They were broad, really broad and human-shaped, but not human. You could see the shape of the toes, long and splayed out. And the stride, the distance between each print was massive, like if I tried to step from one to the next, I'd have to take a running jump. My heart just started thumping in my chest. We both just stared at them. Mark, who's usually the first one to crack a joke, was dead silent. He finally just said, "Bear," but his voice was thin. We both knew. A bear doesn't walk on 2 feet like that. A bear's print doesn't look like a giant, naked human foot. We didn't talk about it much back at camp. Lance was already on edge from the night before, and seeing the footprints just sealed it for him. He got real quiet. We spent the day trying to fish, but nobody could concentrate. The forest, which had just been scenery the day before, now felt like a presence. Every time a branch snapped, we'd all jump. The heavy, oppressive feeling from the first day was back, and it was worse. That evening, as the sun was going down and the shadows were getting long, we were sitting by the fire. It was dead quiet again, no wind, no birds, nothing. And then we heard it. A slow, heavy crunch, crunch, crunch from the tree line. It was the sound of something big walking, taking its time. It wasn't trying to be quiet. The steps were so heavy, you could feel the vibration in the ground. We all froze. I remember the piece of hot dog I was holding halfway to my mouth, my hand just stuck there. Then there was a loud crack from the woods, like a thick tree branch being snapped in two. Not broken and fallen, but snapped with force. A smell hit us then. It's a smell that's burned into my brain. It was musky, like a wet dog, but underneath that was this rotten, sweet smell, like old meat and garbage. It was so strong it made my eyes water and my stomach turn. Lance just lost it. He stood up, his face white, and said, "I'm calling for a pickup. I'm not staying here another night." He had a satellite phone for emergencies. This felt like an emergency. He went into his tent and made the call. The plane was coming for him first thing in the morning. After Lance left the next day, the silence felt even heavier. It was just me and Mark. The camp felt too big, and we felt too small. We tried to act tough, but we both kept looking over our shoulders. We decided to stay close to camp, just hang out by the lake. That's when I had to go get more water. I took the bucket and walked down to the same stream where we'd seen the footprints. New ones were there, overlapping the old ones. My throat went dry. I knelt down to fill the bucket, the cold water swirling around my hands. I was looking down, and I saw it in the reflection on the surface of the water, the trees on the bank behind me, and standing among them, maybe 50 feet back, was a figure. My brain didn't process it at first. It was just a dark shape. Then the details clicked. It was upright, immensely tall and broad, with shoulders that looked way too wide for a person. Its arms were long, hanging down past its knees, and it was covered head to toe in shaggy, dark brown hair. It was just standing there, perfectly still among the trees. It was watching me. I could feel it. I was frozen, crouched by the water, staring at its reflection. I was too terrified to turn around. I just watched it in the distorted, wobbly image on the water's surface. It stood there for what felt like a full minute, and then, without a sound, it was just gone. It didn't walk away. It vanished into the shadows of the forest. I scrambled back to camp, sloshing water everywhere, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I told Mark, my words tumbling over each other. He believed me. He'd seen the footprints. He'd heard the steps. We didn't know what to do. We were stuck there until our pickup the next day. That afternoon, the weather turned. The sky went dark grey, and a cold, hard rain started to fall. We retreated to our tent, zipping ourselves inside this little nylon world. The sound of the rain on the fly was deafening. It was in the middle of that downpour that we heard the voice. It was a woman's voice. It sounded like it was calling out, but the words were all wrong. It was chattering, fast and high-pitched, like someone mimicking human speech without knowing what the words meant. It would rise and fall, sometimes sounding like a question, sometimes like a laugh, but it was all gibberish, and it was close. Right outside the tree line. My blood went cold. There were no women out here. There was no one for miles. We sat in the tent, not speaking, just listening to this horrible, chattering voice mixed with the drumming of the rain. Then we felt it. Something brushed against the side of the tent. A slow, heavy drag against the nylon fabric, right at the top, near the roof. It was too high up for a bear, way too high. That's when I lost it. I grabbed my headlamp, my hands shaking so bad I could barely work the switch. I flicked it on and pointed it at the wall of the tent where the sound had come from. And I saw them. 2 red dots, glowing in the darkness on the other side of the nylon. They were spaced wide apart and they were high up, really high up. They just hovered there, unmoving. They weren't reflecting light. They were generating their own, this faint, hellish red glow. They were eyes. I knew they were eyes, and they were staring right at us. I let out a gasp and dropped the headlamp. Mark was asking me, what is it? But I couldn't form words. We huddled together in the middle of the tent, listening. The chattering had stopped. The brushing had stopped. But we could hear heavy, slow breathing from just outside, a low, rumbling breath that wasn't human. We sat like that for hours, until the rain finally stopped and the first hint of grey light appeared through the tent fabric. When we finally got the courage to unzip the tent, the first thing we saw were the footprints. Deep, bipedal footprints, exactly like the ones by the stream, but this time they formed a perfect circle around our entire campsite. Whatever it was had walked around and around our tent all night long, just outside the ring of trees. The smell of musk and rot was still faintly hanging in the wet air. We didn't speak. We just started packing, our movements frantic and clumsy. We didn't care about folding anything. We just shoved our gear into our packs. We waited on that gravel beach, not venturing more than a few feet from each other, staring at the tree line, waiting for the sound of the plane. When we finally heard it, it was the best sound I'd ever heard in my life. The little float plane came in low and landed on the water, sending up sprays of white. We waded out, throwing our packs in, scrambling into the seats. As the plane started to pick up speed, bouncing on the waves, I looked out my window back at the shoreline we were leaving, and I saw it. It was standing at the edge of the trees, right where the forest met the gravel. It was motionless, the same huge, dark, hairy figure I'd seen in the water's reflection. It was just standing there, watching us go. It didn't wave, it didn't move, it didn't make a sound. It just stood, a solid, impossible thing in the morning light, and watched as our plane lifted off and carried us away from that place. I never went back. I never will. Mark and I don't really talk about it. What is there to say? But sometimes, when it's really quiet, I can still hear that chattering voice, and I can still see those 2 red eyes glowing in the dark, just watching. Story 7. It was one of those perfect Oregon mornings, the kind that makes you forget about leaky pipes and road maintenance budgets for a while. The sun was filtering through the tall Douglas firs, and the air had that clean, damp smell of pine needles and river water. I was the public works foreman for Estacada back then, and a Saturday off with my kids felt like a gift. My two boys, one was 8 and the other was 10, were bouncing around the kitchen before the sun was even all the way up, already asking if we were there yet. We were headed to a spot I knew along the Clackamas River, a place not many folks bothered with because you had to hike a bit to get to it. That was the whole point for me. I liked the quiet. We loaded up the truck with our gear. I had my old 7-foot fly rod, the one I'd had since I was a teenager. The boys had their little spin casting rods. The whole drive out, they were chattering in the cab about what they were going to catch, arguing over who would land the bigger trout. It was just a normal day. That's what gets me, you know. It was so completely, utterly normal right up until it wasn't. We parked the truck in a little dirt pull-off I always used. It was just a widening in the gravel road, really. You could hear the river from there, a constant low rumble from down in the canyon. We got our stuff. I made sure they both had their life jackets on tight. Their mum would have had my head if I didn't, and we started down the trail. The trail wasn't anything official, just a path worn down by deer and fishermen over the years. It was narrow, with ferns and salal bushes brushing against our legs, wet with the morning dew. The ground was soft, a carpet of old brown needles. The boys were ahead of me, laughing and swatting at each other with sticks. I remember feeling good, really good, just a dad with his sons on a beautiful day. The trail wound along the canyon edge for a while before it started to switch back down to the river. We were on that upper part, maybe 5-6 minutes into the hike, when the boys stopped dead in their tracks. They just froze. I was a few steps behind, and my first thought was that they'd seen a snake. "What is it?" I said, coming up beside them, and then I saw it. It stepped onto the path maybe 15 yards ahead of us, just stepped out from behind a big cedar tree like it owned the place. My brain didn't know what to do with it at first. It was like my eyes were seeing it, but my mind was refusing to put the pieces together. It was a man, but it wasn't a man. It was massive. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing had to be at least 1.5 feet taller than me, maybe more. It was built like a powerlifter, but covered in this long, shaggy hair, dark brown, almost black. It wasn't a bear. I've seen plenty of black bears. This stood on 2 legs, straight up, and its arms were long, hanging down past its knees. It just stood there, unmoving, right in the middle of the path, blocking our way. The silence was the first thing that broke. It was the sound of my youngest starting to cry. Not a loud cry, but a scared, hitching sob. He grabbed onto my leg so hard I could feel his fingernails through my jeans. My older boy just made a small, choked sound in his throat and pressed himself against my side. I could feel his whole body trembling. My own heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack one. I couldn't breathe. It was like all the air had been sucked out of the forest. The thing just stared at us. Its face, it wasn't an ape face, not really, it was flatter. The eyes were deep set and dark, and they were fixed right on me. There was no anger in that look, no curiosity even. It was just a look, a presence, an assessment. It was the most intelligent, aware gaze I have ever felt in my life, and it was coming from something that absolutely was not supposed to exist. I had my fly rod in my right hand. It felt ridiculously small and flimsy. My fishing vest had a little tackle box in the pocket, a sandwich, some extra line, nothing that could even begin to help me. My mind was screaming just a single, repeating word: no, no, no. I don't know how long we stood like that. It could have been 5 seconds or a minute. Time got all twisted up. The only things that were real were the pressure of my kids clinging to me and the sheer physical weight of that thing's presence. It was like the air got thicker, heavier. I could smell it then. A musky, wild smell, like a wet dog that had been rolling in something dead. It was pungent and sharp, and it made the back of my throat feel tight. Then it moved. It didn't roar or beat its chest. It just took a step forward, one long, deliberate stride. Its feet were huge. I could see that now. They left deep impressions in the soft earth. It was closing the distance. That's when the panic truly set in. Not just fear, but a raw, gut-level terror that turned my insides to water. My kids were whimpering, too scared now to even make a proper sound. I had to do something. I couldn't fight it. I knew that. It would have torn me apart. My only thought was the truck. We had to get back to the truck. I started backing up, shuffling my feet, pulling the boys with me. I never took my eyes off it. I raised my fly rod, not like a weapon, but just to put something, anything between us. I waved it weakly in its direction, pointing the tip towards its chest, which was a massive barrel of muscle and hair. My voice came out as a croak. "Get back," I whispered. I don't know if I was saying it to the thing or to my kids. Just get back. It took another step, and then another. Its gait was smooth, powerful. It didn't seem hurried. It was just advancing. Its arms swung slightly at its sides, those long fingers curled. I kept backing up, my legs feeling like rubber, my heels catching on roots and rocks. I was terrified of tripping. If I fell, it was all over. The boys were stumbling with me, their small hands gripping my pants, my shirt, anything they could hold. We were moving backwards along the trail, and it was following. It didn't make a sound. No heavy breathing, no snapping twigs. It moved through that forest with a silence that was more frightening than any noise it could have made. It was a ghost, a solid 800-pound ghost. Every second felt like an hour. I could see the ferns we'd passed, the same trees, but now they were just a blurry tunnel leading to our only hope of survival. I kept thinking, just let me see the truck. Please, just let me see the truck. The smell was getting stronger, that wet dog and rotten meat smell, filling my nose, my mouth. I felt like I was going to be sick. Then, through a gap in the trees, I saw a glint of chrome. The truck. We were almost there. The pull-off was just ahead, maybe 20 more yards. Hope, sharp and painful, stabbed through me. "Almost there, boys," I hissed, my voice shaking so bad I could barely form the words. "Almost there." I risked a glance over my shoulder to gauge the distance, and when I looked back, it had stopped. It was just standing there, maybe 10 yards from us now. It was at the edge of the tree line, where the trail opened up into the gravel pull-off. It didn't come out into the open. It just stood at the threshold, watching us. I didn't wait. I turned, grabbing my boys, and we scrambled the last few feet. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely get the keys out of my pocket. I fumbled with the lock on the passenger door. It was an old truck. You had to unlock it from the outside, and I shoved the boys in, practically throwing them across the bench seat. I slammed the door shut and ran around to the driver's side, my heart in my throat the whole time, expecting to feel a hand, a grip on my shoulder. I yanked the door open, fell into the seat, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over with a roar that sounded like a miracle. I didn't even look back. I threw it into reverse, gravel spraying everywhere, and then slammed it into drive. I stomped on the gas, and the truck lurched forward down the road. I drove for a good 5 minutes before I even dared to look in the rearview mirror. The road was empty. Nothing was following us. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands still glued to the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I was breathing in huge, ragged gasps. My older boy was crying quietly, and my youngest was just staring straight ahead, his face pale and blank. I looked at them, and then I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was the color of chalk. My eyes were wide, wild. We just sat there for a long time. Nobody said a word. The only sound was the rough sound of my breathing and the quiet tick of the engine cooling down. I knew I had to report it. I drove straight to the police station in town. I walked in, and the desk sergeant took one look at me and went to get Chief Bob. Bob came out, and he saw me standing there, probably looking like I'd just seen a ghost. My hands were still shaking. I could still smell that smell on my clothes. I told him what happened. I didn't try to pretty it up or make it sound more believable. I just told him the facts, my voice flat and tired. I told him about the thing stepping onto the path, its size, the way it stared, the way it followed us. I told him it stopped right at the edge of the clearing. Chief Bob listened the whole time without interrupting. He was a practical man, not one for flights of fancy. When I was done, he didn't laugh or tell me I'd seen a bear. He just looked at me, really looked at me, and he nodded slowly. "Les," he said, his voice quiet, "you look like hell." He wrote it down in his log. He didn't know what to call it, so he just wrote down exactly what I told him. He saw how rattled I was. He knew I wasn't a man who spooked easily. I'd been a foreman for years, dealt with every kind of emergency you can imagine on a public works crew. He knew what he was seeing was genuine bone-deep fear. We never went back to that spot. I sold my fly rod not long after. Just the feel of it in my hand brought the whole thing back. That was years ago. My boys are grown men now. We've talked about it a few times over the years, but never for long. It's too big, too strange. It sits there in our past, this shared, impossible thing. What haunts me, what has left a permanent mark on me, isn't just the fear. It was the way it just stopped. It followed us all that way, with such purpose, and then it just stopped. At the edge of the trees, like it knew the truck was the line, and it chose not to cross it. It let us go. I think about its eyes. I see them in my dreams sometimes. That deep, calm, intelligent stare. I was just a man with his kids. It was a creature that shouldn't be, and for a few minutes on a trail along the Clackamas River, our worlds collided. I've spent the rest of my life trying to understand what it was and why it let us live. I never have. I don't think I ever will. Story 8. Okay. So I've never really posted anything like this before, but I need to get this out there because it's been eating at me for years, and I still can't shake the feeling that something's not right out here. I've lived on this property my whole life, near Bridgewater, Connecticut, and up until May 2014, I always thought of it as my safe place. But that all changed one day, and I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, because if I don't, I feel like I'm going to burst. It was a warm, kind of humid afternoon in late May, the kind where the air feels heavy and everything's green and buzzing with life. My friend and I decided to kill some time by hitting golf balls out in the back field. We've done it a million times, just whacking them into the tall grass and laughing when we can't find them later. The field's big, maybe a couple acres, surrounded by woods on 3 sides, and beyond that, it's just more forest and the occasional neighbor's place way off in the distance. That day the sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows, and the light had that golden glow that makes everything look peaceful. But peace was the last thing on my mind after what went down. We'd been out there for maybe an hour, just goofing around, when I started to get this weird itch in the back of my neck. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It's not like a sudden shock, more like a slow creep, like someone's eyes are on you and you can't see them. I tried to shrug it off, but then I remembered the stuff that had happened over the past few weeks. Like a couple weeks before, my golden retriever, Buddy, had gone nuts barking one evening, and when I stepped outside, I saw 6 or 7 deer bolting across the field like something was chasing them. And behind them, this huge, dark figure was moving upright through the grass, keeping pace with them. It was broad and covered in thick hair, and it vanished into the woods so fast I almost thought I imagined it. Almost. Then there was the night my friend and I were sitting by a fire, and the woods went dead silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing, and out of nowhere, this deep, piercing screech echoed across the field. It wasn't like any animal I've ever heard, more like something torn between a scream and a roar. The coyotes that usually yip and howl just stopped, and the silence that followed felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. I was terrified, but I pushed it to the back of my mind, telling myself it was just a weird fox or something. But sitting there that day with the golf clubs, all those memories came flooding back, and my skin started to crawl. My friend noticed I'd gone quiet. "You okay?" he asked, and I just nodded. not wanting to sound paranoid, but I could tell he felt it too. The woods had gotten quieter than usual. The birds had stopped chirping, and the only sound was the swish of the grass as we walked through it. We kept hitting balls, but I was on edge, my ears straining for any little noise. My heart was beating a little faster, and I had this cold sweat on my palms that made the golf club feel slippery. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the tall grass about 50 yards away. At first I thought it was just the wind, but the air was still. The grass rustled again, and this time it was more deliberate, like something big was shifting around. I froze, my grip tightening on the club. "Did you see that?" I whispered to my friend, and he nodded, his eyes wide. We both stood there, not moving, just staring at that spot. That's when it happened. The grass parted, and this thing stood up. It rose slowly, straight up, like it was unfolding itself, and it was massive, taller than any person I've ever seen, easily over 7 feet, and built like a linebacker. Its body was covered in dark brown matted hair that looked almost black in the fading light, and it was so thick it seemed to absorb the sun. For a second, it just stood there, perfectly still, and I could see its broad shoulders and how its weight shifted slightly, like it was balancing on its feet. It wasn't hunched over or anything, it was upright, solid, and real. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt this wave of pure terror wash over me. It was like my body knew before my brain did that this wasn't right, wasn't natural. I've seen bears around here, black bears mostly, and deer, and even coyotes up close, but this was nothing like any of them. It didn't move like an animal. It moved with a purpose, a heaviness that felt ancient. Its head was large, and though I couldn't make out distinct features from that distance, I had the sense it was staring right at us. Not in a curious way, but in a way that made me feel exposed, like we were trespassing on its land. My friend let out a low gasp, and I heard him fumble with his golf club, like he was thinking about using it as a weapon. But neither of us moved. We were rooted to the spot, just watching as this thing turned its head slowly, scanning the area. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it turned and started walking back toward the woods. Its stride was heavy and steady, each step making a soft thud that I could almost feel through the ground. It didn't run or hurry, it just walked, like it had all the time in the world, and disappeared into the trees without a sound. As soon as it was gone, the woods seemed to come back to life. Birds started chirping again, and the hum of insects returned, but the relief was short-lived because my legs felt like jelly, and I had to sit down right there in the grass. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, and my hands were shaking. I looked at my friend, and his face was pale, his eyes darting around like he expected it to come back. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, and I just shook my head. I didn't have an answer. We gathered our stuff and hurried back to the house, not saying much, but every rustle in the bushes made us jump. Once inside, I locked the door and peered out the window, half expecting to see it standing there in the twilight. But there was nothing, just the empty field and the dark line of trees. We sat at the kitchen table, and I poured us some water, my hands still trembling. I kept replaying it in my head, the way it stood up, the way it moved, the sheer size of it. It wasn't a person, because no one could be that big and move that way. It wasn't a bear, because bears don't walk upright like that for long, and they're not that tall. It was something else, something I can't explain. Later that night, after my friend left, I called my dad. I had to tell someone, and he's lived here even longer than I have. When I described what we saw, he got quiet on the phone, and then he told me something that sent chills down my spine. He said when he was a kid, he saw something similar out in those same woods, a big, dark shape moving through the trees, and he heard screams at night that didn't sound like any animal he knew. Hearing that from him, someone who's not prone to exaggeration, made it all real in a way I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just me. Others around here have talked about seeing big shapes and hearing those eerie screams, but nobody likes to admit it. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little noise had me bolting upright, and I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see those eyes staring back. The next morning, the field looked normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we're not alone out here, that something shares this space with us, something old and unknown. I've spent my whole life on this land, feeling safe and grounded, but now there's this lingering unease that never quite goes away. I still go outside, but I'm always watching the tree line, always listening for that silence or that screech, and every time I do, I remember that day, seeing it stand up and stare at us, and I'm left with this hollow fear that I'll never be able to explain what it was or why it was there. Story 9. The next morning, we woke up early, around 6. The sun was just starting to peek through the pine trees, and the air was cool and fresh, with that damp, earthy smell you only get in the woods. We made coffee on this old propane stove, the kind that takes forever to heat up, and ate some granola bars. My brother suggested we hike the Desolation Wilderness Trail. He'd done it before and said it was beautiful but remote, really remote. I was still a little spooked from the night before, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I agreed. We packed a backpack with water, snacks, and a first aid kit just in case. I remember putting on my hiking boots and feeling the stiff leather pinch my ankles. I hadn't worn them in years. We started the hike around 7:30. The trail was narrow and rocky, winding through dense forest. Tall pines blocked out most of the sun, so it felt like we were walking in a green tunnel. The ground was soft with fallen needles, and every step made a faint crunch. Birds were chirping, and now and then we'd hear squirrels scrambling up trees. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't shake this nagging feeling in my gut, like we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. My brother noticed and teased me about being city soft. "Relax," he said. "It's just us out here." I forced a laugh, but my hands were clammy, and I kept adjusting the strap of my backpack. After about an hour of hiking, we came to a clearing near a small creek. The sun was higher now, casting dappled light on the ground. That's when I saw movement in the trees to our left. At first, I thought it was a couple of deer, or maybe raccoons. But as I squinted, I realized they were too dark and too small. There were 3 of them, jet black and about the size of chimpanzees. They were playing like kids in a playground. One was swinging from a low branch, another was rolling on the ground, and the third was picking up rocks and tossing them. They made these soft, chattering sounds, not like birds or anything I'd heard before. It was almost musical, but eerie. My brother stopped dead in his tracks, and we both just stood there, frozen. I felt this mix of curiosity and dread. Part of me wanted to get closer, but another part was screaming to run. Then one of them stood up on its hind legs. It was maybe 3 feet tall, with long arms and a hunched back. Its face was hard to make out from that distance, but it had these dark, shiny eyes, and it just stared at us, not moving, not making a sound now. The other 2 stopped playing and looked over too. The air went still. Even the birds had gone quiet. My heart started hammering in my chest. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, despite the cool air. My brother whispered, "What the hell are those?" I didn't have an answer. I'd never seen anything like it. They weren't monkeys. We're in California, not the jungle, and they weren't bears. They were too agile, too human-like in their movements. That's when the bigger one appeared. It came out of the bushes behind the smaller ones, and my blood ran cold. This thing was massive, at least 7 feet tall, covered in thick, grizzly brown hair that looked matted and dirty. Its face was what got me. It was broad and flat, with a heavy brow ridge, like a Neanderthal skull I'd seen in a museum once. But its teeth, when it opened its mouth to let out this low growl, I saw that its teeth were straight and almost human, not sharp or fanged. That made it even more terrifying because it felt wrong, like something that shouldn't exist. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, and its eyes locked onto my brother. I remember thinking, why him? Why not me? Then it charged. No warning, no sound except this thunderous pounding as it ran toward us. Its legs were powerful, eating up the ground in huge strides. The smaller ones scattered, but the big one was focused solely on my brother. I screamed, but it came out as a strangled gasp. My brother's face went white, his eyes wide with pure terror. He stumbled backward, and I grabbed his arm, yanking him toward the only escape I could see, the lake we'd passed earlier. We ran like hell, our feet slipping on the loose rocks and roots. I could hear the creature behind us, its breath coming in ragged pants, and the sound of branches snapping like twigs. My lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. I kept thinking, this is it. We're going to die out here, and no one will ever know what happened. The lake was about 50 yards away, and it felt like miles. I could see the water glinting through the trees. My brother tripped and fell, and I hauled him up, not stopping. Adrenaline was pumping through me so hard that I didn't feel the scrapes on my hands or the ache in my muscles. We burst out of the trees onto the rocky shore, and without hesitation, we plunged into the water. It was freezing, so cold it stole my breath. I gasped, swallowing a mouthful of lake water, and started swimming. My brother was right beside me, his strokes frantic and uneven. I glanced back and saw the creature standing at the water's edge, its chest heaving. It didn't follow us in, it just watched, its eyes boring into us. Then it let out this deep, rumbling sound, almost like a grunt, and turned away. The smaller ones emerged from the trees, and they all walked off into the forest, disappearing like ghosts. We kept swimming until we reached the opposite shore, about 100 feet across. I collapsed on the bank, shivering and coughing up water. My brother was panting, his whole body trembling. We just lay there for what felt like forever, too scared to move. The sun was higher now, warming my wet clothes, but I still felt cold to the bone. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. What were those things? Why did it charge us? I looked at my brother, and his expression said it all. He was as terrified as I was. After a while, we got up and started walking along the shore, trying to find our way back to the trail. We were disoriented and soaked, but we knew we had to get out of there. We eventually stumbled onto a dirt road, and luckily, a pickup truck came by after about 20 minutes. The driver was an older guy who took one look at us, drenched, pale and shaking, and didn't ask questions. He drove us back to the cabin in silence. We packed our stuff in a hurry, not even bothering to clean up, and got in my brother's car. We didn't talk much on the drive back. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that Neanderthal-like face and those straight teeth. We never went back to that cabin or that trail. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear or some kind of prank, but deep down, I know what I saw. That charge, the sheer predatory intent in its eyes, it wasn't something I can explain away. Even now, years later, I have nightmares where I'm running through those woods, hearing those rocks slap together and feeling that thing's breath on my neck. My brother and I still talk sometimes, but we never bring up that day. It's like this unspoken thing between us. I don't know what those creatures were, and I don't want to know. All I know is that in the middle of nowhere, something primal and terrifying reminded me how small we really are, and that's it. I still can't explain it. Story 10. It was a typical Friday in late September. The air was starting to get that crisp edge, and the leaves were turning all shades of orange and red. We'd just finished dinner, and I was washing up in the kitchen while my husband was tinkering with something in the garage. The boys were supposed to be doing their homework, but I could hear them roughhousing in the living room. Then, out of nowhere, the pony started whinnying and kicking up a fuss in the paddock. It wasn't just her usual noise. This was high-pitched, frantic, like she was scared out of her mind. I remember feeling this knot in my stomach right away, because animals don't act like that for no reason. My older son, he's always been the brave one. He grabbed his BB gun from the closet, you know, one of those pump-action ones he uses for target practice, and said he'd go check it out. I told him to be careful, but he just shrugged and headed out the back door. I watched him from the window, the screen door slamming shut behind him. The sun was starting to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. Everything felt normal, but there was this weird stillness in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. He walked down the path toward the paddock, which is about 50 yards from the house, with tall grass on either side. I could see him clearly from the kitchen window. He was about halfway there when he just stopped dead in his tracks. I mean, 1 second he's walking, the next he's frozen like he'd hit a wall. I leaned closer to the window, squinting, and that's when I saw it too. Standing right there in the path, maybe 20 feet ahead of him, was this massive, dark-furred creature. It was huge, way taller than a man and built like a gorilla but standing upright. Its fur was matted and black, almost blending into the shadows, but the setting sun caught it just enough to make out the shape. My son didn't scream or anything. He just stood there, and then his legs gave out. He slid to the ground, like all the strength had left him. I could see the BB gun dangling from his hand, useless. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I yelled for my husband, but my voice came out all shaky. I didn't even know what I was saying, just, "Get out here now!" By the time my husband rushed in from the garage, I was already pulling on my boots, my hands trembling so bad I could barely tie the laces. We both ran outside, and I remember the cold air hitting my face, making me shiver. We hurried down the path, and as we got closer I could see my son still on the ground, pale as a ghost. He was staring straight ahead, and when I followed his gaze, I saw the creature again. It was standing near the edge of the woods, just beyond the paddock. It hadn't moved much, but it was turned slightly, like it was watching us. The pony had gone quiet, which was almost worse. She was huddled in the far corner of the paddock, shaking. My husband helped our son up, and the kid was trembling all over, his breath coming in short gasps. He kept whispering, "What is that, Mom? What is that?" I didn't have an answer. All I could do was hold his shoulder and stare at this thing. It was then that my son, still clutching the BB gun, accidentally snapped a branch under his foot. The sound was sharp, like a crack in the silence, and the creature's head whipped around. Its eyes, I'll never forget those eyes. They were wide and dark, almost human-like, but with this intense primal stare that felt like it was looking right through me. It wasn't angry or aggressive at first, just curious or maybe assessing us. But then its expression changed. Its face tightened, and it let out this loud, piercing scream that echoed through the woods. It wasn't like any animal I've ever heard. Not a bear, not a coyote. It was deep and guttural, but with a high-pitched edge that made the hair on my arms stand up. We were standing on one side of a small creek that runs through our property, and the creature was on the other side, maybe 30 feet away. The creek isn't deep, just a trickle most of the time, but in that moment, it felt like a chasm. After it screamed, the creature took a step forward into the shallow water and raised one of its arms. It wasn't a threatening move, like it was going to attack, but more like a warning, a gesture that said, "Stay back." Its arm was long and muscular, covered in that dark fur, and when it raised it, I could see how massive its hands were, with thick fingers. That's when panic set in. My husband grabbed our son's arm, and I don't even remember deciding to run. We just did. We turned and bolted back toward the house, our feet slipping on the damp grass. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and loud, and behind us there was another sound, like heavy footsteps splashing in the creek. I didn't look back. I just kept running, my lungs burning. My son was sobbing, and my husband was yelling for us to hurry. We burst through the back door, slamming it shut and locking it, like that would do any good against something that size. Inside, we all collapsed on the floor, panting. The younger one had come out of his room, scared by the noise, and he started crying too. We huddled together in the living room, the lights off, peering out the windows. For what felt like hours, we just sat there, listening. The woods were silent again, But it was an eerie silence, like everything was waiting. My older son was shaking uncontrollably, and I held him close, feeling how cold his skin was. He kept saying, "It was looking right at me, Mum. Its eyes." I didn't know what to say to comfort him. After a while, when nothing happened, my husband decided we should call the sheriff. But we lived so far out, it would take them forever to get here. So we waited until morning, none of us sleeping much. I kept hearing every little noise, the creak of the house, the wind in the trees, and my mind would jump back to that scream. The next day, when the sun came up, we ventured outside again, armed with a real rifle this time. The air was cool and misty, and everything looked normal, but we knew it wasn't. We went back to where it all happened, and that's when we saw the evidence. In the soft mud near the creek, there were footprints. Huge footprints, like nothing I'd ever seen. They were at least 18 inches long with 5 toes, and the impressions were deep, like whatever made them was heavy. The grass around was flattened in a big circle, as if something had been standing there for a while. We checked on the animals, and the pony was still skittish, refusing to come near us. The chickens were all huddled in their coop, and our dog, who's usually barking at everything, was quiet and hiding under the porch. That's when my younger son, who'd been quiet most of the time, looked up and said, "Where's the little monkey?" At first, I didn't get it. We don't have a monkey. But then he explained that he'd seen a small, furry animal in the woods a few days before, something that moved fast and chattered, and he'd been calling it the little monkey. He said it hadn't come back since that night. We ended up reporting it to some Bigfoot investigators who operate in the area, folks who've dealt with this kind of thing before. They came out, took casts of the footprints, and interviewed us. They said it matched other sightings, and even some of our neighbors had reported strange noises or missing pets around that time, but knowing that didn't make it any less terrifying. The investigators told us that these creatures are usually shy, but if they feel threatened, they'll defend themselves. That gesture with the arm, it was probably a warning to back off. Life eventually went back to normal, I guess. The pony calmed down, the animals returned to their routines, and we stopped talking about it as much. But that stare, that scream, it's burned into my memory. Sometimes, when I'm out in the garden or walking the dog, I'll get this feeling like I'm being watched, and I'll freeze, remembering those eyes. My older son still has nightmares, and he won't go out alone after dark. We never saw the creature again, and part of me is grateful for that. But another part wonders what it was doing there, why it came so close. I don't have any answers, and I doubt I ever will. All I know is that on that one evening in September, something happened that changed how we see the woods forever. It's not just trees and animals out there. There's something else, something big and silent and ancient, and once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. The fear is always there, just under the surface, like a cold spot in the room that never warms up. And every time I hear a branch snap or the wind howl, I'm right back on that path, staring into those wide, dark eyes, feeling that primal terror all over again. Story 11. It was a Thursday night, I remember, because the garbage truck comes on Friday morning, and I'd been meaning to take the bins down to the gate, but forgot. The air was cool, the kind that nips at your skin, and I'd gone to bed around 10, tired from weeding the garden all afternoon. My husband was already asleep, snoring like a chainsaw next to me. That's important, his snoring. I'd kicked him a few times, half asleep myself, but he just rolled over and kept at it. Eventually, I must have drifted off. The sound that woke me wasn't loud. It wasn't a bang or a crash. It was a rhythm, a steady, deliberate rattle shake, like someone was testing the locks on the shed door, not trying to break them, just feeling them, seeing how they worked. I lay there for a minute, my heart starting to thump a little harder against my ribs. We get deer sometimes rubbing against the outbuildings, but this was different. This was focused. I slid out of bed. the wooden floorboards cold under my bare feet. The moonlight was coming through the window, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. I crept to the window that looks out over the backyard, towards the shed. I didn't stand up. Instinct told me to crouch, to make myself small, to peer over the windowsill like a kid hiding. The shed is about 50 feet from the house. It's an old thing, paint peeling, with 2 big doors that slide on a rusted metal track. We keep tools in there, some old furniture, and yeah, bags of cat food for the barn cats. We also dump deer carcasses out in the far tree line after my husband processes the meat. He's a hunter. It's just what we do out here. For a few minutes, I just watched. My eyes had adjusted to the dark, and the moon was bright enough to see shapes. And then I saw the hand. It wasn't a human hand. That was the first thing my brain screamed at me. It was huge, and it was wrapped around the edge of the shed door, right where the 2 doors meet. The fingers were long and thick, and they were wedged into the gap between the door and the frame, right where the padlock hasp is. The fur was a light black, like charcoal, and it looked wet or oily in the moonlight. It was incredibly muscular. I could see the definition in the forearm, the swell of a bicep. It was just an arm, from the elbow down, working the door back and forth with this patient, powerful motion. Rattle shake, rattle shake. My breath caught in my throat. I remember the taste of my own spit, suddenly metallic with fear. I tried to gauge its size. The top of the shed door is about 7 feet high. This hand was gripping it maybe a foot from the top, so whatever it was attached to had to be tall, really tall. But the thought that flickered in my head, insane as it was that it wasn't fully grown. It felt adolescent. I don't know why I thought that. The sheer size of it should have been enough, but the proportions, the way it moved, it just didn't seem like an adult. Not that I had any frame of reference for what an adult one of these things looked like. The terror was a cold weight in my stomach, spreading outwards, making my fingers tingle. I needed to see more. I needed a better angle. The bedroom window only gave me a side view. I had to get to the back door, which has a bigger window looking straight out at the shed. Moving through my own house felt like a stealth mission in a movie, but there was nothing cool about it. It was pure animal fear. Every creak of the floorboard under my weight was a gunshot in the silence. I could hear my own blood pulsing in my ears. I slipped into the kitchen, the linoleum even colder on my feet. The back door was right there. I dropped to my knees again, crawling the last few feet, and slowly, so slowly, raised my head to look out the window in the door. From here, I had a perfect view. The creature was mostly turned away from me, focused on the shed. It was on 2 legs. It was huge. The shoulders were massive, rounded mounds of muscle that tapered to a narrower waist. Its back was covered in the same light black fur, which was shorter and sleeker than I would have imagined. It looked powerful, like a weightlifter or a gorilla, but standing upright like a man. Its legs were thick, and it shifted its weight from one to the other as it worked the door. The sheer physicality of it was overwhelming. This wasn't some skinny, hypothetical monster. This was a solid, heavy, living thing. My mind was racing, trying to find a rational explanation. A bear? No. Bears don't stand like that, and they don't have hands like that. A person in a suit? Absolutely not. The movement was too fluid, too organic. The muscles under the fur rippled with each movement. This was real. I don't know what came over me. Panic, maybe. A stupid, desperate need to break the spell. My hand, shaking violently, fumbled for the light switch on the wall next to the door. It's one of those old push-button ones. I slammed my palm against it. The porch light flicked on. It's one of those yellow bug lights, so everything was cast in this sickly orange glow. The creature spun around. It was fast, unbelievably fast. 1 second it was focused on the shed. The next, its whole body had pivoted to face the house, and I was looking directly into its face. It didn't have a long, snout-like nose. Its face was flatter, more human-like, but utterly alien. The eyes are what I will never, ever forget. They were a pale, sickly yellow, like old candle wax, and they were wide open. There was intelligence in them. Not human intelligence, but a sharp, aware, wild intelligence. And in that split second, under that yellow light, those eyes locked directly onto mine through the window in the door. Time stopped. My heart didn't just beat, it seemed to shudder to a complete halt in my chest. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. I was pinned by that gaze. There was no anger there, not exactly. It was more like a deep, primal curiosity mixed with a warning, you should not be seeing me kind of look. Then it ran, it didn't lope or amble. It turned and sprinted on two legs into the overgrown field behind the shed. Its motion was effortless, a powerful ground-eating stride that was completely silent. I mean, completely, utterly silent. It was a creature that had to be over 7 feet tall and weigh hundreds of pounds, and it moved through tall, dry grass and weeds without making a single sound. No rustle, no crunch of twigs, nothing. It just vanished into the darkness, swallowed up by the night in a few seconds. The silence it left behind was heavier and more terrifying than the noise it had been making. I was still on my knees, my hands braced against the door, my whole body trembling so hard I thought my bones would shake apart. The cold from the floor had seeped all the way into my core. I felt frozen. I don't know how long I stayed there. It could have been 5 seconds or 5 minutes. Eventually, a sound broke through my paralysis, my husband snoring from the bedroom. The normalcy of it was like a slap. I scrambled to my feet, my legs weak and watery, and stumbled back to the bedroom. I shook him awake. My hands were like ice. "Wake up!" I hissed, my voice a ragged whisper. "Wake up! There's something outside!" He grumbled, still half in a dream. "What? A coon?" "No, it's not a raccoon. It was big, it had hands, it was at the shed." He sat up, finally hearing the sheer, undiluted terror in my voice. I was babbling, pointing towards the back of the house, my words tumbling over each other. I told him about the hand, the fur, the height, the eyes, the yellow eyes. He got his shotgun from the closet and went to the back door. He flipped on the outside floodlights, the big white ones that light up the whole yard. Nothing. The shed door was still. The field was empty and dark. He walked outside, brave or foolish, I don't know, and checked the shed. The padlock was still fastened. There were no footprints that he could see in the hard-packed dirt around the shed. When he came back in, he looked at me, my face pale and tear-streaked, my whole body still shaking. He put his arms around me. "You had a bad dream," he said softly. "I was awake," I choked out. "I was standing right there. I saw it." Later, when I'd calmed down enough to talk coherently, we pieced it together. His snoring. It's loud. I mean, windows rattling loud. We've joked for years that it could call the cattle home. He speculated that the sound might have drawn the creature's attention away from the shed and towards the house, towards our bedroom window. The thought made me feel sick. It had been interested in the cat food, maybe the deer remains, but then it heard him. It knew we were in here. We called the sheriff the next morning. They sent a deputy out, a nice young guy who listened patiently. I told him everything, leaving nothing out. I didn't care if he thought I was crazy. He took notes and walked the property with my husband. They found nothing. No tracks, no fur caught on the shed. Nothing. The deputy said they'd had a few calls about unusual animals in the area over the years, but nothing ever came of it. He said we seemed credible, but without evidence, there was nothing to do. We live on a small family farm. We've got 20 acres, a creek, woods, open fields. It's a perfect little ecosystem. We have ample resources, as the premise said. We grow our own vegetables, we have chickens, we hunt. It's a paradise. Or it was. Now it feels like a cage. Before that night, I thought Bigfoot was a joke, a fun story for campfires I didn't believe, but seeing it, it changes you on a fundamental level. It's not a switch that flips. It's a bomb that goes off inside everything you thought you knew about the world. I saw a living thing that shouldn't exist, and it saw me. It looked right at me. The fear hasn't left. It's been months, and it's still right here under my skin. I keep all the windows closed now, even on hot summer nights. I don't go out after dark for any reason. If the dog needs to go out, I stand at the door with a flashlight, my heart hammering, scanning the tree line. I'm terrified for my kids. What if they see it? What if it comes closer next time? I'm always on watch. Every shadow in the periphery of my vision makes me jump. Every night sound is a potential threat. I saw something that doesn't fit into my understanding of reality, and it left me stranded in this new, terrifying world where the rules I've lived by my whole life no longer apply. It was here. It was real. And then it was gone without a sound, leaving me with nothing but the memory of those wide, yellow eyes and a fear that I know will never, ever go away. Story 12. The first couple of hours were dead quiet. I sat in the living room with the TV on low, half watching some old horror movie, but mostly I was listening for any sounds outside. Every now and then, I'd hear the wind rustling the leaves or a branch tapping against the roof, and I'd jump a little. Around 9, I decided to check on the bowl. I peeked out the window and it was still there, untouched. The motion light on the porch hadn't gone off all night, which was strange because it usually flicked on if a raccoon or something wandered by. I started to feel a bit uneasy, like the silence was too thick. I went back to the couch, but I couldn't relax. My heart was beating a little faster than normal, and I kept glancing at the door, like something was about to happen. Sometime after midnight, I must have dozed off because I woke up to this loud thud from outside. It was that kind of deep, heavy sound that vibrates through the floorboards. I sat bolt upright, my ears straining. Everything was quiet again, but now the air felt different, charged, like before a storm. I got up and tiptoed to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see out. The porch was empty, but the candy bowl was gone, just vanished. My stomach dropped. I thought maybe an animal had knocked it over, but there was no sign of it anywhere. The motion light was still off, which made no sense because if something big enough to take the bowl had been out there, it should have triggered. I stood there for what felt like forever, my hands trembling, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to go out and look, but the other part was screaming to stay inside. In the end, I locked the door and sat on the floor with my back against it, listening. I didn't hear anything else for a while, just my own breathing and the occasional creak of the house. A few hours later, around 4 in the morning, I heard another sound. This time, it was like something heavy being set down on the porch. It wasn't a crash, more like a careful placement. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I forced myself to look out the window again, and there it was, the candy bowl back on the porch. But it wasn't empty. It was filled with stuff that made my blood run cold. I couldn't see clearly in the dark, so I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and shone it through the glass. That's when I saw the bones, cleaned animal bones, white and smooth, arranged neatly in the bowl. There was dark, coarse fur mixed in, and what looked like a dried paw, kind of like a deer's but bigger, and mud, lots of mud, caked on everything. The bowl was placed right in the center of the porch, like it had been set there deliberately. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for the sun to come up. As soon as it was light enough, I unlocked the door and stepped outside, my legs shaky. The air was cold and damp, and the woods were so still it was eerie. The first thing I noticed was the footprints. They were huge, like nothing I'd ever seen. Each one was about 17 inches long, and they were pressed deep into the wooden porch, like whatever made them was heavy. The prints came from the edge of the woods, went up to where the bowl was, and then back. They were clearly two-legged with a wide stride, and the toes were indistinct, almost rounded. I felt a cold sweat break out on my back. I looked at the bowl again, up close. The bones were small, maybe from a rabbit or a squirrel, and they were spotless, like they'd been scrubbed. The fur was black and thick, and it smelled musty, like wet earth and decay. The paw was dry and leathery, with claws still attached. I picked up the bowl. My hands were trembling so bad I almost dropped it and carried it inside. I set it on the kitchen table and just stared at it, trying to make sense of it. Who would do this, or what? The rest of the day I was on edge. I kept looking out the windows, half expecting to see something moving in the trees. I called a friend, but they just said it was probably a prank, which didn't make sense because I didn't have any neighbors close by. Around dusk, I decided to clean up the porch. I got a bucket of water and a brush, but when I started scrubbing the footprints, they wouldn't come off completely. The mud had stained the wood, leaving dark outlines. That's when the fear really set in. I kept thinking about those footsteps I'd heard, heavy, two-legged, and the motion light not working. Why didn't it go off? I checked the light later, and it was fine. It turned on when I waved my hand in front of it. So whatever was out there hadn't triggered it, which meant it wasn't moving like a person or an animal normally would. As night fell, I barricaded myself inside. I pushed a chair against the door and made sure all the windows were locked. I tried to watch TV to distract myself, but every little noise made me jump. Then, around 11, I heard it. Heavy footsteps coming from the direction of the woods. They weren't fast or hurried. They were slow, deliberate, like something big was taking its time. Thump, thump, thump. Each step sounded like it was sinking into the ground, and I could feel the vibrations through the floor. I froze, my breath catching in my chest. I crept to the window and peered out, but it was too dark to see anything. The footsteps kept getting closer, and now I could hear this low grunting sound like breathing, but deeper. It was coming right toward the house. My whole body was shaking. I could feel my knees knocking together. I wanted to run, but I was rooted to the spot, just listening. The footsteps reached the porch, and I heard them stop right outside the door. I expected the motion light to flash on, but it stayed dark. Nothing happened for what felt like minutes, just silence, and that heavy breathing sound. Then, slowly, the footsteps started again, moving away, back toward the woods. They faded into the distance, and everything went quiet. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood there, pressed against the wall, my heart hammering in my ears. When I finally gathered the courage, I checked the door. It was still locked, but now there were fresh mud stains on the porch, matching the footprints from before. I spent the rest of the night in a corner of the living room, too scared to sleep. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I stayed with a friend for a few days, and when I came back, I took down all the Halloween decorations I'd put up. I never set out another candy bowl. A few months later, I moved out. The landlord said he'd had other tenants report weird stuff. Garbage cans dragged into the woods, foul smells like rotting meat, and sometimes deep growls in the night. Hearing that just confirmed it for me. I don't know what it was, but I'm sure it was a Sasquatch. And it wasn't just passing through. It felt like it was making some kind of exchange, like it wanted something from me. To this day, I can't go near those woods without feeling that same terror, and I still don't have any answers. Story 13. Okay, I'll try to write this out the way it happened. I'm still not totally sure what it was, and it's been a couple weeks, but I can't stop thinking about it. My hands are actually shaking a little while I type this. It's one of those things that sounds crazy when you say it out loud, but when you're in it, the crazy feeling is the least of your problems. The fear is just physical. It sits in your guts. It was a Saturday in late September. The air had that crisp, cold bite to it that means summer's really over. We'd decided, my wife, our 7-year-old son, and me, to go bear hunting up near Coal Lake. We're not trophy hunters or anything. It's more about the meat and the time together, getting out of the city. We live just outside Seattle, and the Mountain Loop Highway is our usual go-to when we want to get deep into the woods without a huge multi-day commitment. We left the house around 5 in the morning. It was still pitch black. I remember the sound of the truck door closing, that solid thunk, and then the world outside was just quiet. My son was bundled up in the back seat, half asleep against the window. My wife was in the passenger seat, sipping coffee from a thermos. The plan was simple. Drive the highway, find a good logging road to hike up, see if we could get lucky. The sun came up as we drove, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink behind the jagged peaks of the Cascades. It was beautiful. By the time we turned onto the Mountain Loop Highway proper, it was fully light out. The trees were a wall of dark green and gold, and the river alongside the road was running high and fast with glacial melt. It felt good, normal. We'd been driving for maybe an hour, just taking our time, looking for fresh bear sign on the road, when my wife said she needed to use the bathroom. I spotted one of those Forest Service outhouses a little ways ahead, just a single wooden stall set back in a small pullout. I pulled the truck over and she hopped out. My son was awake by then, playing a game on his tablet. I got out too, just to stretch my legs. I remember standing by the front of the truck, looking up at the sky, and that's when the first little thread of unease started. It was too quiet. I'm in the woods a lot. I know what quiet sounds like. This was different. It wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a deadness. The breeze that had been rustling the tops of the firs had just stopped. There were no birds, not a single chirp or rustle in the underbrush. Usually you hear squirrels chattering, maybe the distant call of a raven. This was a heavy, pressing silence, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I remember looking over at my wife as she came out of the outhouse, and I could see on her face that she felt it too. She just gave me a tight little smile and said, "Spooky out here," before getting back in the truck. I shrugged it off. Maybe a predator was nearby, a cougar or something, and had spooked the smaller animals. That happens. It made sense. We were hunting, after all. I got back in, started the engine, and the sound of it seemed obnoxiously loud in that thick quiet. We pulled back onto the highway. We drove for another 20 minutes or so before I found a decent-looking gravel road heading off into the hills. It was rough, overgrown in places, the kind of road you need 4-wheel drive for. Perfect for finding game. I turned in and we bounced along for about a mile, the trees closing in tight around us. I was driving slow, my eyes scanning the ditches and the tree line for any sign of a bear. That's when I saw it, a pile of scat right in the middle of the road. I stopped the truck and got out to take a look. It was huge. I'm not talking bear huge, I'm talking something else. It was massive, maybe the size of a large coffee can, and filled with what looked like berry seeds and bits of undigested plant matter. It didn't smell like bear scat either. Bear scat has a distinct rank odor. This was different, more pungent, almost acidic, and it was fresh. Steam was still rising from it in the cold morning air. That got my attention. Something big had been here, very recently. I was crouched down, looking at it, when the feeling hit me. It's a feeling every hunter knows. That primal itch between your shoulder blades. I was being watched. I stood up slowly, my head on a swivel. The woods were still dead silent. My eyes scanned the trees, the ferns, the shadows. Nothing moved, but the feeling was so intense it was almost a pressure. It was like I could feel a presence, a weight, focused on me from the dense timber off to the left of the road, down a steep embankment. My heart started thumping a little harder. Adrenaline is a funny thing. It sharpens your senses, but it also makes every little thing feel like a threat. I remember the rough texture of the gravel under my boots as I took a few steps toward the passenger side of the truck, trying to get a better angle to see down the slope. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a soft, heavy crunch of something big stepping on dry leaves. Then a pause, then another crunch. I froze. My rifle was in the truck. I'd been so focused on the scat I'd left it leaning against the seat. Stupid, rookie mistake. I took a slow, careful step back toward the driver's side door. My eyes locked on the spot where the sound had come from. The trees were too thick to see more than 20 feet in. I reached the truck, opened the door as quietly as I could, and grabbed my .3006. The cold, familiar weight of the stock in my hands was a small comfort. I chambered around, the clack-clack sound absurdly loud. I stood by the open door, using it as a partial shield, and just listened. For a minute, there was nothing, just that oppressive silence. Then, from the same general area came a low, rhythmic, thumping sound. It wasn't fast, it was slow, deliberate, like something big was beating its fist against a tree trunk. Not aggressively, just methodically. Thump, thump, thump. My mouth went dry. I'd never heard anything like it. A bear might stand up and smack a tree, but it's a quicker, sharper sound. This was deeper, heavier. It sounded powerful. Then the thrashing started. It was a sudden, violent noise of branches snapping and something big moving through the undergrowth. It wasn't running away. It was moving laterally, parallel to the road, maybe 50 yards down the slope. I could hear the snap, crackle, pop of twigs and small saplings being shoved aside. I raised my rifle, pointing it in the general direction of the sound, my finger resting alongside the trigger guard. I was breathing hard now, my breath pluming in the cold air. I couldn't see a damn thing, just a wall of green and brown. I decided to move. I took a few steps down the road, away from the truck, thinking maybe I could get a sight line from a different angle. The second I moved, the thrashing sound moved with me. It stopped where it was, and a second later started up again from a new position, keeping pace with me. It was mirroring my movement. A cold dread, totally different from the nervous excitement of hunting, started to seep into my bones. This wasn't an animal going about its business. This was stalking behavior. I've been shadowed by a cougar once before, and this felt 1,000 times more intelligent, more deliberate. A bear would have either charged, run away, or ignored me. An elk would have bolted. This thing was playing a game. It was hiding, but it was making sure I knew it was there. I took another few steps. Again, the crashing sound in the trees moved exactly when I did, staying downslope, staying hidden. My nervousness was turning into full-blown fear. I could feel the sweat cooling on my back despite the chill. My knuckles were white where I was gripping the rifle. I backed up slowly toward the truck, my eyes never leaving the tree line. The thrashing stopped when I stopped. It was waiting. I reached the truck and put my hand on the door handle. That's when my son spoke up from the back seat. His voice was small and thin, cutting through the silence and my own hammering heartbeat. "Dad?" he said. I didn't look at him. I couldn't take my eyes off the woods. "Yeah, buddy." "What is it?" "I don't know, son. Probably just a big elk or something." I was lying to him and to myself, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. There was a pause. I could hear the thrashing start up again, a little closer this time. It was moving up the slope. Then my son said it. His voice was absolutely certain, filled with the unshakable logic of a child who hasn't learned what's supposed to be impossible. "It's a Bigfoot." Those two words, they hit me like a physical blow. A chill, cold and sharp, shot straight down my spine and into my legs. It was the kind of chill you read about, but never actually feel. It was the verbalization of the deep, primal fear that had been growing in me since I saw that scat. My son wasn't scared in the way I was. He was fascinated. He'd seen the shows on TV. To him, it was an adventure. To me, in that moment, it was a confirmation of something my rational mind had been fighting against. I looked at him then. His face was pressed to the window, his eyes wide, not with fear but with wonder. He was looking right at the spot where the sounds were coming from. That was it. That was the moment all my hunter's bravado evaporated. The feeling of being hunted, the intelligence behind the stalking, the sheer size implied by the sounds, and now my own son naming the thing I was too afraid to name. It all came together in a wave of pure, undiluted terror. I didn't care what it was anymore. I didn't need to see it. I just needed to be gone. "Get your seatbelt on," I said to my son, my voice tight. I yanked the driver's door open and practically fell into the seat. I slammed the door shut, the thud sounding final, like closing a vault. My wife was staring at me, her face pale. "What's going on?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I just threw the truck into drive and stomped on the gas. The tires spun on the gravel for a second before catching, and we lurched forward. I didn't bother turning around carefully. I just drove, bouncing violently over the ruts, my eyes flicking between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. For a few seconds, as we sped away, the thrashing sound from the woods got louder, more frantic, like whatever it was had broken into a run. I saw movement, a flash of dark brown or black, something huge and upright, moving between the trees, keeping pace with the truck for a terrifying few heartbeats. It was just a glimpse, a shadow in the shadows. But it was enough. It was tall, way too tall. And then we rounded a bend in the road, and the sound stopped. The forest fell away behind us. We didn't speak for a long time. I drove too fast all the way back to the highway, my hands clenched on the steering wheel. My son was quiet in the back, maybe finally sensing the real fear that had taken hold of me and his mom. We got back on the pavement, and I didn't slow down until we were miles away. The normal sounds of the forest slowly returned, birds, the wind, the river. It was like waking up from a bad dream, except the cold knot of fear in my stomach remained. I've replayed that morning in my head 1,000 times. The silence, the scat, the feeling of being watched, the intelligent mirroring movement, the thrashing, the sheer size of whatever was in those trees, and my son's voice, so sure and calm. "It's a Bigfoot. I'm a practical man. I fix things for a living. I believe in what I can see and touch." But I can't explain what happened that day. I can't reconcile it with any animal I know. All I have is the memory, the chill that still comes back when I think about it, and the haunting, simple certainty of a 7-year-old boy who saw a monster on TV and recognized it in the woods. Story 14. Okay, so I've never really talked about this before, but I've been reading some of the stories on here about weird encounters in the woods, and it made me remember something from when I was a kid. I'm still kind of shaken up thinking about it, even though it happened years ago. I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, living in this rural area surrounded by woods and fields. Our house was pretty isolated, and I spent a lot of time playing outside because there weren't many other kids around. That's how I met Ansag. I need to start by saying that this all happened on one specific day, the day everything changed. Before that, I'd been playing with Ansag for what felt like weeks, but that last day is burned into my memory. I'll try to describe it as best I can, but it's hard, because even now I get this tightness in my chest when I think about it. It was a hot, humid afternoon in late summer. I remember the air feeling heavy, like it was pressing down on everything, and the sun was so bright it made the leaves on the trees look almost too green. I'd been out in the woods behind our house, near this old well that everyone said was dried up. I wasn't supposed to go there alone, but I did it all the time because that's where I first saw Ansag. He was just there one day, standing between 2 big oak trees, and at first I thought he was just a weird-looking kid from somewhere else. But he was hairy, not like super furry, but he had this dark, coarse hair all over his arms and legs, and even a little on his face. He was tall for a kid, maybe a head taller than me, and he moved in this clumsy, shuffling way that made him seem older than he looked. We started playing together after that. He'd show up most days, and we'd build little forts out of sticks or throw rocks into the well. He never talked much, just made these grunting sounds or pointed at things. I didn't think much of it at the time because I was a kid, and he was just my friend from the woods. But looking back, there were signs that something was off. Like his eyes were kind of deep set and dark, and he smelled weird, a mix of damp soil and something musky, like an animal. He'd always bring me little things, like shiny rocks or feathers, and once he gave me a piece of bark that had teeth marks on it, which I thought was cool, but now gives me the creeps. Anyway, the day it all went down started like any other. I woke up early, had breakfast, and begged my mum to let me go outside. She was busy canning tomatoes from the garden, so she just nodded and told me to stay close to the house. But as soon as I was out the door, I headed straight for the woods. I remember feeling excited because I hadn't seen Ansag in a couple of days, and I missed him. The path to the well was familiar, dirt packed down from my footsteps with ferns brushing against my legs and mosquitoes buzzing around my ears. It was quiet except for the birds chirping and the rustle of leaves under my feet. When I got to the clearing near the well, Ansag was already there. He was sitting on a fallen log, picking at the bark with his fingers. He looked up when he saw me, and his face didn't have its usual slow smile. Instead, he seemed nervous, his eyes darting around like he was watching for something. I remember thinking he might be sick or something because he was breathing kind of heavy and his hair was matted with sweat. I asked him if he wanted to play, but he just shook his head and made this low grumble. That's when I noticed he was holding something, a torn piece of cloth that looked like it came from a shirt. He handed it to me, and it was damp and smelled even stronger than usual, like rotten leaves and wet dog. I took it because I didn't want to hurt his feelings, but I felt a little uneasy. We sat there for a while, not doing much, just throwing pebbles into the well. The sound of them hitting the bottom was hollow and echoey, and it made the silence between us feel heavier. After maybe half an hour, Ansag stood up and started pacing. He kept looking toward the deeper part of the woods, where the trees got thicker and darker. I asked him what was wrong, but he just grunted and pointed back toward my house. I thought he wanted to go there, which was weird because he'd never come to my house before. My mom didn't like strangers, especially ones she hadn't met, and Ansag definitely looked like someone she wouldn't approve of. But he seemed insistent, so I figured it might be okay for a little while. We started walking back through the woods, and I remember the sun was starting to get higher, making the heat worse. My t-shirt was sticking to my back, and I could feel sweat trickling down my temples. Ansag walked beside me, but he was quiet, and every now and then he'd stop and listen, like he heard something I didn't. Once he froze, and his whole body went stiff, and I saw the hair on his arms stand up. I asked him what it was, but he just shook his head and kept walking faster. When we got to the edge of the woods, near our backyard, I could see my mom in the garden, bent over picking tomatoes. She had a big basket next to her, and the red tomatoes stood out against the green plants. Ansag hesitated at the tree line, his eyes wide as he watched her. I tugged on his arm and whispered that it was okay, but he didn't move. Then, after a minute, he stepped out into the open. My mum must have heard us because she straightened up and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. When she saw Ansag, her face went from curious to shocked real fast. I could see her eyes narrow, and she put her hands on her hips. "Who's that?" she called out, her voice sharp. I started to explain that he was my friend, but before I could say much, Ansag darted forward toward the garden. He moved in this jerky, almost clumsy run, and he went straight for the tomato plants. My mom shouted at him to stop, but he didn't listen. He started grabbing tomatoes and ripping them off the vines, not eating them or anything, just stripping them and throwing them on the ground. The red pulp splattered everywhere, and the smell of crushed tomatoes mixed with the musky odor coming off him. I remember feeling embarrassed and scared because I'd never seen him act like that. My mom ran over, her face red with anger. "Get away from there," she yelled, and she grabbed the broom she'd left leaning against the fence. Ansag didn't seem to notice her at first. He was too focused on destroying the tomatoes. But when she swung the broom and hit him on the back, everything changed. The moment the broom made contact, Ansag let out this sound. It wasn't a human cry, more like a deep, guttural roar that came from somewhere low in his chest. It was so loud and raw that it felt like it vibrated through the ground. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst out. Ansag spun around, and his face wasn't the friendly, curious one I knew. His eyes were wild, almost black, and his lips pulled back to show teeth that looked too big and sharp for a kid. The hair on his body seemed to bristle, and he stood up straighter, towering over my mum. My mum stumbled back, dropping the broom, and her eyes were wide with fear. I'd never seen her look that scared before. She grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the house, but I couldn't take my eyes off Ansag. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, and he let out another roar that made the hair on my neck stand up. Then he turned and ran back toward the woods, disappearing into the trees so fast it was like he'd never been there. The whole thing probably only lasted a minute or two, but it felt like forever. My mom was shaking, and she dragged me inside, locking the door behind us. She didn't say anything at first, just held me tight, and I could feel her heart pounding against my shoulder. I was trembling too, and my legs felt like jelly. The smell of tomatoes and that musky odor lingered in the air, making me feel sick. Later, when we calmed down a bit, my mom asked me about Ansag. I told her everything, how we'd met, how he never talked, how he lived in a cavern or something near the well. She didn't get mad. She just looked pale and told me never to go back to those woods again. I didn't need to be told twice. For days after that, I had nightmares about that roar and the way Ansag's face changed. I'd wake up sweating, sure I could still smell him in my room. I never saw Ansag again after that day. Sometimes I'd look out my window toward the woods, half expecting to see him, but it was always just trees and shadows. A few times I thought I heard strange sounds at night, deep grunts or something moving around outside. But I never told anyone. My mom didn't either. She just started keeping a closer eye on me and made sure the doors were locked tight. Even now, as an adult, I can't explain what happened. Was Ansag just a strange kid, or was he something else? The way he looked, the sounds he made, the way he vanished, it all points to something not human. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, and it fits, especially the descriptions of young ones, but I'll never know for sure. All I know is that one day my wood friend turned into something terrifying, and the memory of it still gives me chills. I avoid woods and isolated places to this day, and every time I smell tomatoes or damp earth, my stomach knots up. It's like a part of me is still stuck in that moment, waiting for something to jump out of the shadows. Story 15. All right, so I'm just going to dive right into this because honestly, I still get chills thinking about it, and it's been years. I've never really talked about it much, not even with the guys who were there, because it's one of those things that sounds crazy when you say it out loud. But here goes nothing. Back when I was in my 20s, me and a couple of friends decided to take a road trip down to Kentucky. We were all from up north, and we'd heard about Mammoth Cave, you know, the big tourist spot, and figured it'd be a cool way to spend a weekend. We'd been driving for hours, just shooting the breeze, listening to music, and generally killing time. It was one of those lazy summer nights where the air feels thick and warm, even with the windows down. The sky was pitch black because we were way out in the country, no city lights to mess with the stars. I remember the hum of the tires on the asphalt, the way the headlights cut through the darkness like a knife, and the smell of damp earth and pine hanging in the air. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, like the calm before a storm. We were on this narrow country road somewhere near Brownsville, just a few miles from Mammoth Cave. The road was winding, with trees crowding in on both sides, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Every now and then, we'd pass a farmhouse with a single porch light on, but mostly it was just us and the night. My friend in the passenger seat, let's call him Jake, though that's not his real name, but I don't want to use actual names. Anyway, Jake had been quiet for a while, and then he suddenly piped up, saying he really needed to take a leak. Badly. Like, couldn't hold it anymore kind of badly. We'd all had a few sodas earlier, so it wasn't a surprise, but the timing felt off because we were in the middle of nowhere. I slowed the car down and pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. The tires crunched under us, and the car rocked to a stop. I left the engine running because, I don't know, it felt safer that way. The headlights were still on, blazing straight ahead into a patch of woods. It wasn't a dense forest, more like a thinning out of trees with some underbrush, but it was dark enough that you couldn't see much beyond what the lights touched. Jake unbuckled his seatbelt and swung the door open, muttering something about finally getting relief. He stepped out, and I could hear his footsteps on the gravel as he walked toward the edge of the trees, maybe 10 or 15 feet away from the car. I was sitting in the driver's seat, just watching him through the windshield. My other friend, let's say Mike, was in the back seat, half asleep and not paying much attention. The radio was playing some classic rock station softly in the background, but I turned it down a notch because the silence outside felt heavier somehow. I remember leaning forward, my hands still on the steering wheel, and just staring ahead. The headlights were illuminating this one spot where the trees thinned out, and right in the middle of the beam there was what looked like a short, stubby tree. It was maybe 6 or 7 feet tall, thick and dark, with no leaves that I could see. It didn't look unusual at first, just another part of the landscape. But then, as Jake was fumbling with his zipper, my eyes locked onto that tree, or what I thought was a tree, because it started to move. Not like a branch swaying in the wind, but a slow, deliberate turn. The whole thing rotated like it was pivoting on its base, and then it took a step, a fucking step. My brain short-circuited for a second. I blinked, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me from being tired, but no. It moved again. It wasn't a tree at all. It was something else, something alive, and it was walking away from us, deeper into the woods. The movement was unmistakable. It had this lumbering, heavy gait, like it was dragging its feet, but it was fast, not running, but purposeful, like it knew exactly where it was going. The shape was bulky and dark, almost blending into the shadows, but the headlights caught enough of it to see that it wasn't human. It was too big, too broad, and the way it moved was all wrong. There was no sound, no cracking twigs or rustling leaves, just this eerie silence as it disappeared into the darkness. My heart started hammering in my chest so hard I could feel it in my throat. I froze, my fingers gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I couldn't look away. Jake must have seen it too, because he stopped what he was doing and just stood there, staring. I saw his face in the headlights, pale, eyes wide, mouth hanging open. He didn't even finish unzipping his pants. He just turned and sprinted back to the car, stumbling over the gravel. He yanked the door open and practically fell into the passenger seat, breathing like he'd run a marathon. "Did you see that?" he gasped, his voice shaky. "What the hell was that?" I didn't answer right away. I was still processing it. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand up and walk like that, not for long. And this thing was upright the whole time. It wasn't a person either. No one would be out here in the middle of nowhere, dressed in what looked like dark fur or something, moving like that. The only thing that came to mind was those stories you hear about Bigfoot, but I'd always brushed them off as nonsense. Until now. Mike stirred in the back seat, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on? Why'd we stop?" I didn't take my eyes off the spot where the thing had been. The headlights were still shining on that empty patch of woods, but there was nothing there now, just shadows and trees looking perfectly normal again. But I knew what I'd seen. That thing had been real, and it had been close, too close. "We need to go," I said, my voice coming out as a croak. I didn't wait for a response. I shoved the gear shift into drive and hit the gas, maybe a little too hard. The tires spun on the gravel before catching, and the car lurched forward. I didn't look back, I just focused on the road ahead, my hands trembling on the wheel. The headlights cut through the darkness, but now every shadow seemed to move. Every tree looked like it might turn and walk away. Jake was breathing heavily beside me, and I could hear him fumbling with his seatbelt. "What was that thing?" he repeated, his voice rising with panic. "It looked like, I don't know, like a person, but not. Did you see how it moved?" I nodded, but I couldn't form words. My throat was dry, and my stomach was in knots. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us, but there was nothing, just blackness. The road twisted and turned, and I drove faster than I should have, the car swaying on the curves. Mike was fully awake now, leaning forward from the back seat. "What happened? You guys are freaking me out," Jake started explaining, his words tumbling out in a rush. "There was this thing in the woods, like a tree or something, but it moved. It just turned and walked away. It was huge, man. I've never seen anything like it." Mike laughed nervously. "Come on, you're kidding, right? Probably just a deer or something." But Jake and I both knew it wasn't a deer. Deer don't stand on two legs and walk like that. Deer don't have that kind of bulk. I replayed the moment in my head over and over. The way it turned, the slow, deliberate steps, the sheer size of it. It was like my brain had taken a snapshot, and I couldn't shake the image. The fear was visceral, a cold weight in my chest that made it hard to breathe. We drove in silence for what felt like forever, but it was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. The whole time, I was hyper-aware of every sound. The wind whistling through the cracked window, the engine humming, the tires on the road. My senses were on high alert, and every little noise made me jump. I kept expecting to see something in the headlights again, but the road was empty. Eventually, we reached a more populated area with streetlights and houses, and I started to relax a little. But the fear didn't go away. It just settled into a low hum in the back of my mind. We didn't talk about it much after that. What was there to say? We all knew what we'd seen, but admitting it felt like inviting more trouble. We finished the drive to our motel near Mammoth Cave, but the rest of the trip was overshadowed by what happened. We went through the motions, toured the cave, ate at diners, joked around, but there was this tension underneath everything. Every time we were outside at night, I'd find myself scanning the trees, half expecting to see that dark shape again. I've thought about that night a lot over the years. What was it? A bear? A person in a costume? But neither of those explanations fit. Bears don't move like that, and why would someone be out in the middle of nowhere, dressed like that, just standing there? And the way it walked away, it was so smooth, so natural, like it belonged there. It wasn't startled or running, it was just leaving, like we'd interrupted its nightly routine. The more I've read about Bigfoot encounters, the more it lines up. The size, the movement, the location near a wooded area like Mammoth Cave. But I don't have any proof, no photos or anything, just the memory burned into my brain, and the worst part is, I'll never know for sure. It's one of those things that just hangs there, unanswered. Sometimes when I'm driving at night on a country road, I'll see a dark shape in the headlights and my heart will skip a beat, but it's always just a tree or a shadow. Still, for that split second, the fear comes rushing back, fresh and raw, like it happened yesterday. And that's it. That's what happened. We never went back to that spot, and I doubt I ever will. Story 16. I've never been able to forget what happened to me that day, and even now, more than 20 years later, it still haunts me. I'm Shannon Morgan, and I grew up in a small town in the Pacific Northwest, surrounded by dense, ancient forests that felt like they went on forever. Back then, I was just a kid, 10 years old, and my whole world was those woods behind our house. I spent most of my days exploring the trails on the bike my grandfather gave me for my birthday, a shiny red thing that made me feel invincible. But there was one trail I always avoided. It wasn't marked or anything. It was just this narrow path that dipped down into a gully where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. Every time I passed it, I'd get this cold, heavy feeling in my chest, like something was warning me to stay away. My friends and I called it the Shadow Trail because it just felt dark and wrong, but no one ever talked about why. That particular day started out like any other summer morning. The air was warm, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled my lungs as I pedaled down the familiar paths. I'd been riding for maybe an hour, just looping around, when I decided enough was enough. I was tired of being scared of that trail. My best friend lived on the other side of the woods, and if I took the Shadow Trail, I could cut my time in half and surprise her. It felt like a stupid, brave idea, the kind kids have when they're trying to prove something to themselves. So I turned my bike toward the entrance of that trail. The moment my front wheel crossed onto the path, it was like hitting an invisible wall. This electric jolt shot through my body, so sharp and sudden that my hands flew off the handlebars and I almost tumbled over. It wasn't like touching a faulty wire. It was more like the air itself had turned solid for a split second, buzzing with energy that made my teeth ache. I managed to stop the bike, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I just stood there shaking. I remember looking around, expecting to see something, a downed power line or some kind of equipment, but there was nothing. Just the usual trees and ferns, but everything felt different already. I got off my bike to check if something was wrong with it, but it seemed fine. That's when I noticed the silence. Normally, those woods were alive with noise. Birds chirping, squirrels chattering, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But here, it was dead quiet. Not a single sound, like someone had flipped a switch and muted the world. The air felt thicker too, harder to breathe, and the light had this weird greenish tint, like we were underwater. I started to feel this prickle on the back of my neck, the kind you get when you know you're being watched. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was freaking myself out over nothing. I decided to push on, thinking I'd just ride through quickly and get it over with. But after only a few more feet, the sky darkened out of nowhere. 1 minute it was overcast, but bright. The next, clouds rolled in so fast it felt unnatural. Then the rain started, not a gentle drizzle, but a downpour that came down in sheets, soaking me to the bone in seconds. The trail turned to mud almost instantly, thick, sticky mud that clung to my tires. I tried to pedal through it, but my back wheel sank in deep, and no matter how hard I pushed, it wouldn't budge. I remember the squelching sound as I yanked at the bike, my hands slipping on the wet handlebars, mud splattering up my legs. Panic started to set in because I was stuck alone in this place that already felt wrong. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first I thought it was just the rain or my imagination, but then they got louder, heavy, rhythmic thuds that made the ground vibrate under my feet. Each step sounded like a tree falling, and they were getting closer. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I could feel the vibrations through the soles of my shoes, a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I slowly turned my head, and that's when I saw it. Emerging from between the trees was this massive creature, at least 10 feet tall, covered in thick, matted black hair that was dripping with rain. Its eyes glowed this eerie, bright green, like two embers in the gloom, and they were fixed right on me. I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my whole body trembling. The creature took another step, and the ground shook so hard I had to brace myself against my bike to keep from falling. It let out this low growl that wasn't quite animal or human. It was deeper, more guttural, and it seemed to echo in the silence. I felt this primal fear wash over me, the kind that makes your stomach drop and your mind go blank. I started begging, just whispering at first, then louder. "Please don't hurt me, please, I'm sorry, I'll leave." My voice was shaky, and tears mixed with the rain on my face. I didn't know what else to do. I was just a kid, terrified out of my mind. The creature glared at me, and it stomped its foot again, making the mud splatter and the trees around us shudder. I thought that was it, that it was going to charge or something. But then I heard another set of footsteps approaching from the other side, lighter but still heavy, and faster. Another creature came into view. This one was smaller, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall, with brownish hair that was clumped with wet leaves. It stopped a few yards away, and the two of them seemed to communicate without making a sound. There was this tension in the air, like they were having some kind of silent argument. I could see the smaller one gesturing with its head, and the larger one let out this frustrated huff before turning and stomping away, its footsteps fading into the distance. The smaller creature looked at me for what felt like forever. Its eyes weren't glowing like the others. They were darker, almost curious. It didn't feel threatening in the same way, but I was still frozen with fear. Then it made this soft, grunting noise, almost like it was reassuring me, before it turned and disappeared back into the trees. As soon as it was gone, the rain stopped abruptly, like someone had turned off a faucet. The sky brightened, the greenish tint faded, and the sounds of the forest rushed back in, birds singing, leaves rustling, as if nothing had ever happened. The mud around my bike seemed to loosen, and when I tried to pull it out, it came free easily, like it had never been stuck. I didn't waste any time. I jumped on my bike and pedaled as fast as I could, my heart still racing, my clothes soaked and clinging to me. I didn't look back until I reached my friend's house. She was outside, and she asked why I was so pale and dirty, but I just mumbled something about the rain and mud. We went inside, and I tried to act normal, but I couldn't stop shaking. Later, when I got home, I told my grandfather everything. He's a practical man, not one for superstitions, but he saw how scared I was, so he took me back to the trail the next day to investigate. We walked the whole length of it, but there was nothing, no footprints, no strange marks, just ordinary woods. He said it was probably a bear or my imagination, but I knew what I saw. To this day, I can't explain it. I've never seen anything like it again. But that encounter left a mark on me. Sometimes when I'm in the woods, I'll get that same electric feeling or hear a strange noise, and it all comes rushing back. I don't know if I crossed into another dimension or if it was something else. But I do know that for one day, the world I thought I knew turned upside down, and I've never been able to forget the terror of those glowing green eyes and the silence that swallowed everything. Story 17. I've been turning this over in my head for weeks now, trying to find some logical explanation, some way to make it fit into the world as I understand it. But I can't. I just can't, so I'm writing it down here, because if I don't tell someone, I feel like I'm going to scream. This happened on a Saturday, the last Saturday in August. I remember because it was the weekend before Labor Day, and I'd been thinking that summer was almost over. I'd driven up to this lake in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It's a place I go to sometimes when I need to get away from everything. No phone service, no people, just quiet. It's not a big, famous lake. It's one of those smaller, unnamed ones you find if you know where to look, tucked back in a network of old logging roads that are more like dirt trails. The shoreline on one side is all public land, with a little gravel pull-off where you can park and put a boat in. But the other side, the eastern shore, is just wild. It's not a clean, pretty wilderness. It's a dense, tangled mess of cedar swamp and thick forest that's basically impossible to walk through. The water gets shallow and mucky for about 20-30 feet out, choked with lily pads and fallen logs. Nobody goes over there. Nobody. I got there in the late afternoon. The air was already getting that cool, sharp edge that means autumn isn't far off in the UP. I'd brought my little 12-foot aluminum John boat with the electric trolling motor. Nothing fancy. I just wanted to float, maybe cast a line for some pike, and not think for a few hours. For the first couple of hours, it was perfect, just what I needed. The sun started to dip down, painting the sky in oranges and purples. The water was like glass. I was over on the western side, the accessible side, drifting along and not catching a damn thing. I didn't care. The silence was so heavy and complete, it was almost a sound itself. You know that kind of quiet, where your own breathing seems loud? As it got darker, I decided to move over to the eastern shore, the swampy side. I don't know why. Maybe I thought the fish would be hiding in the structure over there. Maybe I just wanted to look at something different. I pointed the little electric motor that way and putted slowly across the lake. It's not wide, maybe a couple 100 yards across. When I got close to the other side, I cut the motor and let the boat glide to a stop about 15 feet from the shore. The water was too shallow and weedy for the propeller anyway. The sun was completely gone now. The last of the light was just a faint grey smear in the west. Over here, under the canopy of the trees, it was already full night. I could see the outline of the forest, but it was just a solid wall of black. I remember the smell hitting me, that thick, sweet, rotten smell of a swamp, decaying vegetation and stagnant water. I baited my hook again and cast my line towards the lily pads. That's when I heard the first splash. It was a heavy, solid kerplunk in the water, maybe 10 feet to the left of my boat. I jerked my head towards the sound. My first thought, my only thought, was that it was a big fish, a pike or a muskie jumping, or maybe a beaver slapping its tail. It made sense. I turned back to my fishing rod, my heart rate settling back down. About 30 seconds later, another one. Kerplunk. This one was closer, maybe 8 feet away, a bigger splash. I stared into the darkness towards the shore, but I couldn't see a thing. It was too dark. The tree line was just a deeper black against the dark sky. I felt a little prickle on the back of my neck. It was probably just another fish, I told myself. They were feeding. Then the third one came, and this one was different. It wasn't a soft kerplunk. It was a hard, sharp, crack splash. It landed so close to the boat that water droplets hit my face. I flinched back, my whole body going tense. That wasn't a fish. A fish makes a different sound. This was the sound of something solid and heavy breaking the surface of the water, something that didn't belong there. I stood up in the boat, making it rock unsteadily. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded small and stupid in the vast quiet. "Is someone there?" There was no answer, just the absolute silence of the swamp. No frogs, no insects, nothing. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. The hair on my arms was standing up. I was still trying to convince myself it was a person. Some idiot kid throwing rocks. But that was insane. There was no way to get over to that shore on foot. The swamp was a mile deep of impassable, boot-sucking muck and tangles. No trails. Nothing. Then the fourth one came. I heard it before it hit. A faint whistle in the air for just a split second. Then, thwack splash. It was a rock. I saw it clearly this time. A dark, fist-sized chunk of something that hit the water not 2 feet from my boat. The spray soaked the side of my jeans. Panic. Real, cold, gut-twisting panic flooded through me. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a fish. Someone or something was standing on that shore in the pitch blackness, and it was throwing rocks at me, and it had damn good aim. My mind was racing, a frantic, useless jumble. I dropped my fishing rod. It clattered on the aluminum bottom of the boat. I scrambled to the back, to the motor. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the pull cord for my backup gas motor. It's a small 5-horsepower thing, but right then it felt like my only lifeline. I yanked the cord. It sputtered and died. Come on, I begged, my voice a tight whisper. I looked over my shoulder at the shore. I still couldn't see anything, just that impenetrable wall of darkness. But I could feel it. Something was in there, watching me. I yanked the cord again. This time it roared to life, a shockingly loud sound that shattered the silence. The relief was so intense, it was almost dizzying. I shoved the tiller handle hard, pointing the boat back towards the middle of the lake, towards the western shore and my truck. I jammed the throttle wide open. The little boat lurched forward, the bow rising up out of the water, and that's when I heard the other sound. Over the roar of the motor, I heard a different noise from the shore, a loud, frantic splashing, not the gentle lapping of water. This was a violent churning sound, like something very big was crashing through the shallow water, moving fast, but it wasn't the rhythm of something on four legs. It wasn't the steady pat-pat-pat of a deer. This was a heavy, distinct, two-part rhythm. Stomp, splash, stomp, splash, stomp, splash, bipedal. Something running on two legs through the knee-deep water and muck of the swamp's edge. It was moving parallel to the shore, away from me. The sound of its footsteps was huge. Each stomp was a deep, powerful thrust, followed by a huge splash as it pulled its foot free from the muddy bottom. The sound faded fast, getting further and further away, swallowed by the distance and the trees within just a few seconds. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just stared straight ahead at the faint outline of the western shore. My knuckles white on the tiller, my whole body rigid with a terror so complete I couldn't even breathe right. I was taking these short, ragged gasps. My heart wasn't just pounding. It felt like it was trying to batter its way out of my chest. I didn't stop until I was dead center in the lake. The far shore was a safe, dark line, and the eastern shore was an equally distant, terrifying one. I killed the motor. The sudden quiet was deafening. I was shaking all over, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that started in my hands and ran through my whole body. I just sat there in the silence, listening. Nothing. No more rocks. No more footsteps. Just the gentle lap of water against my boat and the high-pitched ringing in my own ears from the adrenaline. I looked back at the eastern shore. It was just a shape, a black cutout against a slightly less black sky. There was no way anyone could have been there. No human could have gotten through that swamp in the dark without a light. No human could have thrown rocks that size with that much force and accuracy from that far into the shadows. And no human I've ever heard of runs through waist-deep water with footsteps that sounded that heavy, that powerful. That's when the real horror set in. It wasn't the panic of the moment anymore. That was a hot, sharp fear. This was a cold, sinking dread that settled deep into my bones. It was the realization that I had no idea what that was. The unknown presence, as you put it in the premise. That's exactly what it was. It was an intelligence. It knew I was there. It deliberately threw rocks at me. It wasn't just some animal making noise. It was a deliberate, aggressive act. I sat out there in the middle of the lake for a long time. I don't know how long. Long enough for the moon to rise, casting a weak, silvery light on the water. I was too scared to go back to the western shore, to my truck, because that meant getting closer to that side again, even if it was across the water. I was too scared to move at all. I kept replaying the sounds in my head, the hard crack of the rocks hitting the water, the sheer weight of them, the terrifying bipedal rhythm of those retreating footsteps. Stomp, splash, stomp, splash. That sound is burned into my brain. Eventually, the cold and the sheer exhaustion from the adrenaline crash forced me to move. I started the motor again, my hands still shaking, and puttered at a slow pace back to the western shore. I kept my eyes locked on the eastern side the whole time, expecting to see something, anything, emerge from the trees. Nothing did. I loaded the boat onto the trailer faster than I ever have in my life, fumbling with the straps, my head on a swivel, listening for any sound from the woods behind me. I jumped in my truck, locked the doors, and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop shaking until I was on the main highway, with other headlights in the distance. I've gone over it 1,000 times. A bear? Bears don't throw rocks. They don't walk on two legs for that long, that fast, through water. A moose? Same thing. A person? Absolutely impossible. The geography alone makes it impossible. There is no access. So what was it? I keep coming back to the stories you hear about this state. The old tales, and I was always a skeptic. I thought it was all just campfire nonsense, but I can't call it nonsense anymore. Not after what I heard. Not after feeling those rocks land, knowing they were meant for me. Not after hearing the sheer power in those footsteps as it ran away, a sound that didn't belong to any animal I know. I haven't been back to that lake. I don't think I ever can. I still go fishing, but I stick to bigger, busier lakes now. Places with people. Every time I'm out on the water and it gets dark, I find myself staring a little too long at the tree line, my heart starting to beat a little too fast. I keep waiting to hear a splash that isn't a fish. I keep listening for a rhythm in the silence that walks on two legs, and I know with a certainty that chills me to my core that something was out there that night. Something that knew I was there. And something that wanted me to know it was there too. I don't have an explanation. I just have the memory and the fear that came with it, and the feeling that I got a glimpse of something I was never supposed to see. Story 18. It was the middle of October, 1987, the X1 deer season. My buddy and I were up in the Sierra, way off the main roads, in country so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. We'd been out since before first light, hiking ridges and glassing canyons, and we'd come up empty. Not that it mattered much, just being out there was the main thing. We'd made camp in a small draw, a spot we'd used a couple times before. It was sheltered, with a little spring that was usually reliable, though that year had been dry as a bone. That night, after a dinner of beans and sausages heated over the fire, we were just sitting there, letting the day drain out of our bones. The fire was down to a bed of glowing coals, and the air had that sharp, cold bite that comes with altitude once the sun goes down. We weren't talking much, just sipping coffee from tin mugs, listening to the pop and crackle of the fire, and the absolute silence of everything else. To the south of our camp, there was a clearing, maybe a couple hundred yards away, lit up by a moon that was just past full. It was bright enough to throw shadows. I was staring into the coals, not really looking at anything, when my partner nudged me and pointed with his chin towards that clearing. "Bear," he said, his voice low. I looked. There was a dark shape moving along the edge of the trees on the far side of the meadow. It was big and black, and it moved with a kind of heavy, shuffling gait. We watched it for a minute as it ambled along, then disappeared back into the timber. We didn't think anything of it. You see bears. It's part of being out here. We went back to our silence. Maybe 20 minutes later, that's when it started. The sound came from the east, from the steep, brush-choked mountainside that rose up right behind our camp. It wasn't a subtle sound. It was the sound of dry brush breaking. A lot of it, like something big was just plowing through it, not even trying to be quiet. Not a deer. A deer is light, quick. This was heavy, deliberate. It sounded like someone was up there with a sledgehammer, just smashing the manzanita and scrub oak to pieces. We both sat up straight, coffee forgotten. We looked at each other, and I know my own confusion was mirrored on his face. Then the screaming started. I have never heard a sound like that before or since. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized. It wasn't a coyote or a mountain lion or a bear. It was guttural, a raw, tearing scream that seemed to come from a chest the size of a barrel. It was loud, impossibly loud, and it had a rage in it that made the hair on my arms and the back of my neck stand straight up. It was the kind of sound that doesn't just go into your ears, it goes right down your spine and into your gut, turning everything to ice water. The screaming and the crashing through the brush happened together, a chaotic, violent symphony coming down the mountain straight towards us. It felt like the whole hillside was coming alive. We were on our feet now, rifles in hand, but we didn't even shoulder them. We just stood there, frozen, staring up into the blackness of that slope, trying to see what was making that god-awful noise. The sound moved downhill fast. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it faded. The screams got farther away, moving back up the mountain, and then they were gone. The silence that came back was heavier than the noise had been. It was a thick, pressing silence. My ears were ringing. I could hear my own blood pulsing in my head. My buddy let out a breath he must have been holding for a full minute. "What in the holy hell was that?" he whispered. His voice was shaky. I just shook my head. I didn't have an answer. We stood there for a long time, just listening, but there was nothing. The normal night sounds, the crickets, the little rustles in the leaves, were all gone. Everything was holding its breath. We tried to talk ourselves down. A bear, maybe a big one, fighting with something, but it didn't fit. The sound was wrong. The way it moved was wrong. Bears don't scream like that. Nothing screams like that. We built the fire back up, throwing on every piece of wood we had within reach until the flames were leaping 3-4 feet high, throwing crazy dancing shadows all around the camp. The light made me feel a little better, but not much. We were both jumpy, staring out into the dark beyond the firelight, our rifles held tight. For about 20 minutes, nothing happened. The world was still dead quiet. We started to relax, just a fraction. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it was just some freak one-time thing. Then it came back. The first sound was a crash from the same hillside, but closer this time, much closer. It sounded like it was just above the camp. Then the screaming started again, and it was louder, more intense, if that was even possible. It was a sound of pure, undiluted fury. It wasn't just an animal call. It was a threat. It felt personal. This thing knew we were here, and it was letting us know it wasn't happy about it. Right in the middle of this new wave of screaming, we heard a heavy, rolling, thumping sound. Something big and solid was tumbling down the slope. It crashed through the brush, bouncing and rolling, and finally came to a stop with a heavy thud, somewhere just outside the ring of our firelight. We never saw what it was in the moment, but the sound of it, the sheer weight of it, made my stomach clench. And then the smell hit us. The wind was coming from the north, a light breeze that had been pleasant all evening. Now it carried a stench that made me gag. It was a combination of things, all of them horrible. The overwhelming note was like rotting meat, a sweet, putrid smell of something dead and bloated. But mixed in with it was this sharp, eye-watering reek of ammonia. So strong it was like sticking your head in a bucket of piss and chemical cleaner. It was the worst smell I have ever encountered in my life, in or out of the woods. It was so thick and foul, it felt like it was coating the inside of my nose and my throat. My buddy coughed and spat. I felt my eyes watering, and my stomach heaved. That was the last straw. The noise was terrifying, but this smell was wrong. It was unnatural. It was the smell of something sick, or something that lived in death. "We got to get in the tent," I said, and my voice was a croak. He just nodded, his face pale in the firelight. We backed towards our tent, never turning our backs to the hillside. We dragged our rifles and a big armful of firewood with us. We scrambled inside the canvas tent, zipping the flap shut. It felt pathetically flimsy. We sat there on our sleeping bags, rifles across our laps, listening. The screaming continued for another 10 minutes. It was right there, just outside. It would move from one side of the camp to the other, the sound circling us. The smell was so potent it seeped through the tent fabric. We were breathing through our mouths, but you could still taste it, a foul, metallic taste at the back of your tongue. We just sat there, staring at the shadow of the tent wall, lit from the outside by our big fire. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. I was shaking. A fine, constant tremor that I couldn't control. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might break one. Then the screaming stopped. The silence was instant and absolute. It was more frightening than the noise. At least with the noise, we knew where it was. Now, it could be anywhere. We waited, straining to hear anything. A minute passed, then another, and then we saw it. The fire was blazing, casting a strong orange light. The side of our tent was glowing with it. Suddenly, a massive shadow fell across the canvas. It blotted out the light completely, plunging our side of the tent into deep shadow. This wasn't the flickering shadow of a tree branch. This was a solid, dense black shape that moved between the fire and our tent. I stopped breathing. The shape was upright, it had 2 legs, and it was huge. The outline was of broad, impossibly wide shoulders that tapered down to a narrower waist. It didn't have the shape of a bear on its hind legs. A bear is top-heavy, round. This was built like a man, but a man who was 7, maybe 8 feet tall and built like a linebacker. The head was blocky, set directly on those massive shoulders with no real neck to speak of. It didn't move fast. It just stood there, its shadow holding us in darkness. I could feel its presence. It was a physical pressure, a weight in the air. I could hear my own blood roaring in my ears. My buddy had his rifle stock pressed into his shoulder, his finger on the trigger guard, but he was as frozen as I was. What do you shoot at? A shadow on a tent. It felt like it stood there for an hour, but it was probably only 5-10 seconds. Then slowly the shadow began to move. It drifted off to the side, and the firelight slowly returned, washing back over the tent wall. We listened, but we heard nothing. No footsteps, no breaking twigs. Nothing. It had just vanished. The rest of the night was dead quiet. The normal sounds of the forest did not return. We didn't sleep. We sat there in the tent, backs against each other for some kind of pathetic comfort, holding our rifles until our hands ached, staring into the darkness until the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the canvas. When the sun was properly up, we finally unzipped the tent flap and stepped out, slow and cautious, like we were expecting a trap. The camp was exactly as we'd left it, except for the fire, which was now just a pile of white ash. The air was clean, the horrible smell was gone. The first thing we did was look at the ground around our tent, around the fire. We were looking for tracks, for any sign. The ground was dry and packed, covered in pine needles. There was nothing, not a single print. It was like it had never been there. Then we looked towards the spring, about 50 feet from our camp, and we saw it. A log, a big one, maybe 8 feet long and thick as a telephone pole. It was lying right across the path to the spring. It hadn't been there the day before. We would have had to move it to get water. We walked over to it. It was old and weathered, covered in moss, and it was heavy. There was no way the wind blew it there. This was the thing we'd heard tumbling down the hill. This thing had thrown it or rolled it and placed it right at our water source. That's when the pieces clicked into a horrible kind of sense. It had been a dry year. That spring was the only water for miles. We'd parked my old pickup truck right near it. I think that thing didn't like our truck being there. I think it was telling us to leave. The screaming, the smell, the log across the spring. It was all a message, a warning. We didn't say a word to each other. We just looked at that log, then back at the empty, silent hillside. We packed our gear in a frantic, clumsy hurry, throwing everything into the truck bed without any care for organization. We got in the cab, I turned the key, and the engine roaring to life was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. We didn't look back as we bounced down that dirt track, leaving that camp and whatever was in those woods behind for good. I've never gone back to that part of the Sierras. I still hunt, but I stick to more open country now. I never told this story to anyone but my buddy, and we don't talk about it. What would we say? We didn't see a monster. We saw a shadow. We heard a scream. We smelled a smell. We found a log. It doesn't sound like much when you say it out loud, but out there in the dark with that thing standing between us and the fire, it was everything. It was a primal, gut-level knowledge that we were not at the top of the food chain, that there are things in those deep, old woods that don't have a name, and we are better off not knowing them. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, and if the wind is right, I swear I can smell that rotten ammonia stench, and I'm right back in that tent, a scared kid holding a rifle that felt about as useful as a toy, waiting for the shadow to return. Story 19. We were on White Elephant Road, which runs right along the lake, and it was maybe 8 or 9 at night. The road is pretty winding and narrow in spots, with trees crowding in on both sides, and every now and then you get a glimpse of the water through the gaps. It's usually a peaceful drive, especially at night, with the sound of crickets and frogs filling the air, but that night everything felt different. I can't really explain why, but I remember feeling a little on edge even before we saw anything. Maybe it was the full moon, or just the stillness of the lake, but I had this weird sense that something was off. I was driving slow, taking my time because the road can be tricky in the dark, and my wife was sitting beside me, half dozing herself. The radio was on low, playing some country station, but I wasn't really listening. My eyes were glued to the road ahead, and that's when I saw it. We were passing by this lakeside home, one of those older houses set back from the road with a dock stretching out into the water. And there, in the shallow part of the lake, was this enormous figure wading in the water. I mean, it was huge, like at least 8 feet tall, and it was just standing there, knee-deep in the lake, with its back partly turned to us. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. I thought maybe it was a bear or something, but bears don't stand upright like that, and they're not that tall. This thing was built like a person, but way bigger, with broad shoulders and long arms, and it was covered in dark, shaggy hair that gleamed in the moonlight. But what really made my blood run cold was what it was holding. In its left hand, it had what looked like the head of a dog, and I could see flesh hanging from the neck, raw and ragged, like it had been torn off. The head was just dangling there, and the creature was standing perfectly still, like it was examining it or something. I must have gasped or made some noise because my wife jerked awake and asked me what was wrong. I couldn't speak for a second. My throat felt tight, and my hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I just pointed, but by then we were already moving past it, and all she saw were ripples in the water where it had been standing. She asked me what I saw, and I tried to tell her, but the words came out all shaky. I said something like, "There was something in the water, something big, and it had a dog's head." She thought I was joking at first, but then she saw the look on my face and knew I wasn't. I sped up a little, my heart pounding in my chest, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it following us. But the road curved and the lake disappeared from view, and all I could see was darkness behind us. The kids were still asleep, thank God, but my wife was wide awake now, and she kept asking me to describe what I saw. I told her as much as I could remember: the height, the shape, the way it was standing, and that damn dog's head. I remember my voice trembling, and I had to swallow a few times to keep from choking up. The image was burned into my mind, that massive, shadowy figure holding the severed head, with the moonlight reflecting off the water and highlighting the gruesome details. We drove the rest of the way home in silence, except for the soft hum of the engine and the kids' quiet breathing from the back seat. I could feel the adrenaline fading, leaving me shaky and cold. My wife reached over and put her hand on my arm, and her touch felt like a lifeline. She didn't say much, but I could tell she was scared too, even though she hadn't seen it clearly. When we got home, I parked the car in the driveway and just sat there for a minute, staring at the house, but not really seeing it. My mind was still back at the lake, replaying what I'd seen over and over. We got the kids inside and put them to bed without waking them fully, and then my wife and I went into the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water, but my hands were still shaking so bad, I spilled some on the counter. We started talking in hushed voices, like we were afraid someone might hear us. I told her everything again, more detailed this time, and she listened without interrupting. She said she believed me, but I could see the doubt in her eyes, mixed with fear. Who wouldn't doubt something like that? It sounded crazy, even to me, and I was the one who saw it. We decided not to call the police or anything, because what would we say? Hey, we saw a Bigfoot holding a dog's head in the lake? They'd think we were nuts. Plus, We didn't want to scare the kids or draw attention to ourselves, so we just tried to put it out of our minds and go to bed. But I couldn't sleep. I lay there next to my wife, listening to her breathe, but all I could see when I closed my eyes was that creature, the way it stood, so still and powerful like it belonged there, and the way the dog's head looked. The eyes were gone, and the flesh around the neck was torn with bits of fur and skin hanging loose. I could almost smell the coppery scent of blood, even though I was miles away. After a while, I got up and went to the window, looking out into our backyard. The full moon was still high in the sky, casting long shadows, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept thinking about the lakeside home we'd passed. I knew the people who lived there vaguely, and they had 2 dogs, big friendly mutts that would bark at anyone who came near. The thought hit me then. What if that was one of their dogs? The head looked about the right size, and the location matched. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I had to sit down because my legs felt weak. The next day, we heard through the grapevine that both of those dogs had gone missing. The homeowner told people they must have died naturally or run off. But I knew better. I didn't say anything to anyone, but my wife and I talked about it in private. She suggested that maybe I should let it go, but I couldn't. That image haunted me, still haunts me, and I started wondering if digging up the remains around that area would confirm what I saw. There's a place called the Honeycomb area near there, where people have found weird things over the years, and I've thought about going back to look for clues. But every time I consider it, I get this cold fear in my gut, like I'm tempting fate by poking around. I never did go back, not to that spot, not at night. Even during the day, I avoid White Elephant Road if I can help it. My wife says I've been different since that night, more jumpy, especially when the moon is full. She's right, I am. I can't shake the feeling that we stumbled onto something that wasn't meant to be seen, something ancient and terrifying that lives in the shadows of this town. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting, but I'll never know for sure, and that's what kills me. I saw what I saw, and no amount of rationalizing can make it go away. It's just there, stuck in my head, a memory that feels more like a nightmare, but one I know is real.